On a hot Cape Cod summer night, flames clawed at bedroom windows like twisted fingers. Inside, 6-year-old Michelle Dorr slept, unaware that death had silently entered her home. Disguised in women's clothes, armed with a kitchen knife, and fueled by dark fantasies that would haunt investigators for years. This is not just another murder case. This is the chilling chronicle of Haddon Irving Clark, a shape-shifting predator who stalked his victims through suburbia's false sense of security, leaving behind a trail of blood, ashes, and psychological devastation that would span 3 decades. A man so deeply disturbed that even hardened detectives would struggle to comprehend the depths of his depravity. Tonight, we descend into the fractured mind of America's most elusive serial killer, a phantom who moved through neighborhoods like smoke, striking without warning, vanishing without trace, only to resurface years later with even more horrific crimes. From the blood-soaked beaches of Cape Cod to the nightmare landscape of rural Maryland, we'll uncover the systematic brutality of a killer who didn't just murder his victims. He erased them from existence itself. Prepare yourself for a journey into pure evil. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story of the fire murders. Evil doesn't emerge from a vacuum. It festers, grows, and metastasizes in the toxic soil of dysfunction, neglect, and twisted psychology. To understand the monster that Haddon Irving Clark would become, we must first excavate the poison ground from which he sprouted. A childhood so warped and disturbing that it reads like a blueprint for creating a serial killer. Born on July 31st, 1952, in Troy, New York, Haddon Clark entered a world that seemed determined to break him from his very first breath. His father, Bradfield Clark, was a Navy man whose rigid military discipline masked deeper psychological fractures. His mother, Flavia, struggled with her own demons that would manifest in ways both subtle and devastating to her children's developing minds. The Clark household wasn't just dysfunctional. It was a psychological pressure cooker where violence simmered beneath a veneer of middle-class respectability. Neighbors would later describe hearing screaming matches that echoed through the night, the sound of breaking glass, and children's cries that seemed to go unanswered. But behind closed doors, something far more sinister was taking root. From his earliest memories, Haddon exhibited behaviors that should have sent chills down his parents' spines. While other children played with toys, young Haddon was fascinated by death, collecting dead insects, dissecting small animals he found, and displaying an unnatural interest in fire that would later become his signature calling card. His mother would find matches hidden in his bedroom, along with the charred remains of dolls and action figures. Their plastic faces melted into grotesque expressions of agony. School became another battleground for the troubled child. Teachers noted his inability to connect with other children, his tendency toward explosive violence when frustrated, and his disturbing habit of staring at female classmates with an intensity that made grown adults uncomfortable. At age 7, Haddon was caught attempting to set fire to the school bathroom. When confronted, he showed no remorse, only a cold, calculating stare that seemed to peer directly into the darkest corners of human nature. But it was at home where Haddon's psychological fractures began to widen into chasms. His father's military discipline included brutal physical punishments that crossed the line from correction into outright abuse. Belt whippings were common, but more disturbing were the psychological torments. Being locked in dark closets for hours, forced to stand at attention until his legs gave out, and subjected to verbal assaults that systematically dismantled his sense of self-worth. His mother's response to the family chaos was equally damaging. Flavia Clark retreated into a world of prescription medications and emotional unavailability, leaving her children to navigate the toxic family dynamics alone. When she did intervene, it was often to enable Haddon's increasingly disturbing behavior, making excuses for incidents that should have resulted in professional intervention. The first clear sign that Haddon was evolving into something truly dangerous came at age 9. The family cat, Whiskers, was found in the basement, not just dead, but mutilated in ways that suggested both methodical planning and sadistic pleasure. The animal had been systematically tortured before being killed, its body arranged in a ritualistic manner that spoke to a developing fantasy life filled with control, domination, and death. When confronted about the cat, Haddon's response was chilling in its matter-of-fact delivery. "It made too much noise. I fixed it." There was no emotion in his voice, no recognition that he had done something wrong. It was simply a problem that had been solved with clinical efficiency. His siblings lived in constant fear of their brother's escalating violence. His younger sister would later describe nights spent barricaded in her bedroom, listening for the sound of Haddon's footsteps in the hallway. She spoke of finding her dolls mutilated, her pet goldfish dead in their bowl with tiny puncture wounds, and the growing certainty that her brother was capable of turning his violence toward human targets. The psychological evaluations that followed the cat incident painted a picture of a child already lost to the darkness. Clinical notes described complete lack of empathy, profound detachment from reality, and emerging psychopathic tendencies. One psychiatrist wrote with unusual bluntness, "This child represents a clear and present danger to those around him. Without immediate and intensive intervention, I fear we are looking at a future of escalating violence that could culminate in tragedy." But the 1960s were a different time, when mental health resources were scarce and the understanding of childhood psychopathy was limited. Instead of the intensive treatment Haddon desperately needed, he was shuffled between schools, therapists, and family members, each hoping someone else would find the key to fixing what was clearly broken beyond repair. The family's frequent relocations due to his father's military career only exacerbated Haddon's problems. Unable to form lasting relationships or establish roots, he became increasingly isolated and consumed by his dark fantasies. His notebooks, when discovered years later, revealed elaborate plans for torture scenarios, detailed drawings of violence against women and children, and a developing obsession with fire as both a tool of destruction and a means of covering his tracks. By his early teens, Haddon had begun experimenting with cross-dressing, not as an expression of gender identity, but as a tool for manipulation and concealment. He discovered that wearing women's clothing allowed him to move through the world differently, to get closer to potential victims without arousing suspicion. It was during this period that he began stalking neighborhood children, following them home from school, learning their routines, and fantasizing about what he would do when the opportunity arose. His first serious assault came at age 14. A younger child in the neighborhood went missing for several hours, only to be found tied up in an abandoned building, traumatized and barely coherent. The victim described being approached by someone in women's clothing who seemed friendly at first, then turned violent when they were alone. Physical evidence suggested the child had been tortured, though the full extent of the assault was kept from the public to protect the young victim. Haddon was questioned but never charged, his family's connections and the lack of definitive evidence allowing him to escape consequences once again. But investigators noted his calm demeanor during questioning, his detailed knowledge of the crime scene, and his apparent disappointment that the victim had been found alive. The pattern was established. Haddon Clark was not just disturbed. He was evolving into a sophisticated predator with an insatiable appetite for violence and the intelligence to avoid capture. The warning signs were all there, documented in police reports, school records, and psychiatric evaluations. But somehow, the system failed to contain the growing threat. As Haddon entered his late teens, the fantasies that had sustained him through childhood were no longer enough. The urge to kill, to dominate completely, to reduce human beings to objects for his pleasure, had grown beyond his ability to control. He began planning his first murder with the same methodical precision he had once applied to torturing insects. The stage was set for one of America's most horrific killing sprees. The broken child had become a monster, and he was ready to unleash hell on an unsuspecting world. The only question was who would be unlucky enough to cross his path first. That answer would come on a humid summer night in 1986, when Haddon Clark decided it was time to graduate from fantasy to reality. His target: a sleeping 6-year-old girl whose only crime was living in the wrong house at the wrong time. Michelle Dorr never had a chance. The summer of 1986 should have been magical for 6-year-old Michelle Dorr. Living in the idyllic coastal town of Brewster, Massachusetts, she spent her days building sandcastles, chasing seagulls along the pristine beaches of Cape Cod, and falling asleep to the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore. Her world was one of innocence and safety, or so her family believed. But evil was already stalking through their neighborhood, watching, waiting, and planning an act of violence so brutal it would shatter the community's sense of security forever. Haddon Irving Clark had arrived on Cape Cod like a plague carried on summer winds. At 34 years old, he was a drifter living on the margins of society, sometimes sleeping in his car, sometimes finding temporary shelter with distant relatives who didn't yet understand the true nature of the man they had welcomed into their homes. To the casual observer, Haddon appeared relatively harmless. A slight, disheveled figure who kept to himself and seemed more pathetic than threatening. But behind his unremarkable exterior lurked a predator who had spent decades perfecting his craft. His childhood experiments with violence had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying. He had learned to read his environment like a hunter studying prey, identifying vulnerabilities, escape routes, and opportunities with the calculating precision of a military strategist. The Dorr family's modest home on Robbins Hill Road became the focus of Haddon's attention through a combination of opportunity and obsession. He had been working sporadically as a handyman in the area, taking odd jobs that gave him access to neighborhoods and allowed him to study the daily routines of potential victims. The Dorrs had unknowingly invited the wolf into their midst when they hired Haddon to perform some minor landscaping work on their property. For weeks, he observed their patterns with the patience of a spider monitoring its web. He knew that Michelle's father, Robert, left for work early each morning. He knew that her mother, Donna, was a heavy sleeper who often took medication to combat insomnia. He knew that little Michelle's bedroom was on the ground floor, with windows that faced the wooded area behind the house, perfect for an undetected approach. But what truly drew Haddon to the Dorr family was Michelle herself. During his brief interactions with the child while working on their property, he had become fixated on her innocence, her trust, and her vulnerability. In his twisted mind, she represented the perfect victim, young enough to be easily overpowered, isolated enough to be taken without immediate detection, and innocent enough to provide the psychological satisfaction he craved from completely dominating another human being. The night of August 31st, 1986, began like any other for the Dorr family. Robert and Donna tucked Michelle into bed, read her a bedtime story, and kissed her goodnight, never imagining it would be the last time they would see their daughter alive. As the house settled into peaceful quiet, Haddon Clark began his final preparations for murder. He had planned every detail with obsessive precision. Dressed in women's clothing, a tactic he had perfected over the years to confuse potential witnesses and throw off police investigations, he approached the Dorr home through the wooded area behind the house. His disguise was disturbingly effective. A floral dress, women's shoes, and a wig that transformed his appearance completely. In the darkness, anyone catching a glimpse of him would remember seeing a woman, not a man. Clutched in his hand was a kitchen knife he had stolen from another house, its blade honed to razor sharpness and its handle wrapped in cloth to prevent fingerprints. But the knife was just one tool in his arsenal. He also carried rope, duct tape, and a small container of gasoline, materials that revealed the true scope of his horrific intentions. The window to Michelle's bedroom had been left slightly open to let in the cool night air, a small mercy that became a gateway for evil. Haddon pried the window open with practiced silence, his movements as careful and deliberate as a surgeon making an incision. Years of breaking into homes had taught him exactly how much pressure to apply, which materials creaked under stress, and how to move through unfamiliar spaces without disturbing sleeping occupants. Michelle Dorr was sleeping peacefully when death entered her room. Her small body was curled beneath a cheerful comforter decorated with cartoon characters, her breathing slow and steady in the rhythm of innocent dreams. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to end in unimaginable terror and pain. What happened next defies comprehension and challenges our most basic assumptions about human nature. The physical evidence recovered from the scene would later paint a picture of violence so extreme, so methodical, and so utterly devoid of mercy that even veteran investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. Haddon's first move was to wake Michelle, not out of any sense of fairness or warning, but because he wanted her to be conscious and aware of what was happening to her. The psychological component of his violence was just as important as the physical act itself. He needed to see the fear in her eyes, to feel her helplessness, to experience the complete power and control that came from holding another person's life in his hands. The 6-year-old child woke to find a figure in women's clothing standing beside her bed, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through her bedroom curtains. Her first instinct was confusion rather than fear. The intruder looked like a woman, someone who might be there to help rather than harm. That moment of innocent trust was exactly what Haddon had counted on. When Michelle opened her mouth to call for her parents, Haddon's hand clamped over her face with crushing force. The knife appeared at her throat, its blade cold against her skin, and her confusion instantly transformed into pure terror. Her small body went rigid as primal fear flooded her system, the recognition that something incomprehensibly evil had invaded her safe space. "Don't make a sound," Haddon whispered, his voice distorted by excitement and anticipation. "If you scream, I'll hurt your mommy and daddy too." The threat was calculated to ensure Michelle's compliance while simultaneously amplifying her terror. At 6 years old, she was old enough to understand the implications of his words, but too young to devise any strategy for escape or resistance. She was completely at his mercy, and Haddon Clark had no mercy to give. What followed was a systematic torture session that lasted for over an hour. The details are too graphic to fully describe, but the evidence told a story of prolonged suffering that pushes the boundaries of human comprehension. Haddon used not just the knife, but his bare hands, household items, and psychological torments to slowly destroy an innocent child's body and spirit. Michelle fought with the desperate strength that only terror can provide. Her small fingernails left scratches on Haddon's arms and face, evidence that would later prove crucial in his eventual capture. She tried to call out to her parents, only to have her voice muffled by his hands or reduced to barely audible whispers by the knife at her throat. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The most disturbing aspect of the crime was Haddon's apparent enjoyment of Michelle's suffering. Investigators would later note that he took his time, savoring each moment of control, each expression of fear, each plea for mercy. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was recreational violence practiced by someone who had found his true calling in the infliction of human misery. As Michelle's strength began to fail and her resistance weakened, Haddon made his final, fatal moves. The knife work was methodical and precise, designed to cause maximum suffering while preventing the quick death that would have ended her torment. He wanted her to experience every second of dying, to understand exactly what was happening to her, to carry that knowledge into whatever came next. When Michelle Dorr finally died, sometime around 3 a.m. on September 1st, 1986, she had endured horrors that no human being, let alone a 6-year-old child, should ever experience. Her small body bore evidence of torture so extensive that the coroner would later describe it as the worst case of child murder he had encountered in 30 years of forensic medicine. But Haddon Clark wasn't finished. The murder was only the beginning of his plan. With Michelle's lifeless body before him, he began the ritualistic destruction that would become his signature. First came the mutilation, additional cuts and wounds inflicted post-mortem that served no purpose except to satisfy his sick fantasies. Then came the positioning, arranging her body in ways that reflected his twisted psychology and his need to transform human beings into objects for his pleasure. Finally came the fire. Haddon poured gasoline throughout Michelle's bedroom, soaking the curtains, the bedding, and her small corpse. The flames were meant to serve multiple purposes: destroy evidence, create confusion among first responders, and provide Haddon with the visual spectacle he craved. Fire had always fascinated him, and watching it consume his victim represented the ultimate expression of his power over life and death. But as the flames began to spread through Michelle's room, Haddon made a crucial error. In his excitement and haste, he failed to account for the speed with which the fire would grow. What he had envisioned as a controlled burn quickly became an inferno that threatened to consume the entire house, including the parents he had planned to leave alive as witnesses to his handiwork. The fire alarm's piercing shriek shattered the night silence, jolting Robert and Donna Dorr from deep sleep into their worst nightmare. Smoke was already filling the hallway as they stumbled from their bedroom, their minds struggling to process what was happening. Robert's first thought was to reach Michelle's room, but the flames had already made that section of the house impassable. "Michelle!" Donna screamed, her voice carrying across the neighborhood as neighbors began to wake and respond to the emergency. "My baby! Someone help us!" The fire department's response was swift, but by the time they arrived, Michelle's room was completely engulfed. The firefighters worked with desperate efficiency, knowing that every second counted, but the intense heat and thick smoke made rescue attempts nearly impossible. It would take hours to contain the blaze and even longer before they could safely enter what remained of Michelle's bedroom. When they finally reached her room, the scene was one of absolute devastation. The fire had consumed most of the physical evidence, reducing furniture to charred skeletons and transforming a little girl's cheerful sanctuary into a hellish landscape of ash and melted debris. But it hadn't destroyed everything, and what remained would tell a story of evil beyond imagination. Michelle's body, though severely burned, still bore evidence of the torture she had endured before the fire. The coroner's examination would reveal that she had died from her injuries, not from smoke inhalation or burns, confirming that she had been murdered before the fire was set. The knife wounds, the defensive injuries on her hands and arms, and the positioning of her remains all pointed to a premeditated killing followed by an attempt to cover up the crime. As investigators processed the scene, a picture began to emerge of what had actually happened in that bedroom. This wasn't a random house fire that had tragically claimed a child's life. It was a carefully planned murder that had used fire as both a weapon and a tool of concealment. Someone had deliberately killed Michelle Dorr in the most brutal way possible, then tried to erase the evidence with flames. The question that haunted everyone involved in the case was simple yet terrifying. Who could do such a thing to an innocent child? And perhaps even more disturbing, were they still out there, ready to strike again? The answer to both questions was yes. Haddon Clark had successfully committed his first perfect murder, and he was already planning his next. The fire that was meant to destroy evidence had instead awakened something even more dangerous: a serial killer's confidence in his ability to torture, murder, and disappear without consequence. Michelle Dorr's death was not just a tragedy. It was the birth announcement of America's most elusive serial killer. And this was only the beginning. The murder of Michelle Dorr should have been Haddon Clark's downfall. Instead, it became his graduation ceremony, a blood-soaked rite of passage that transformed a disturbed drifter into something far more dangerous: a confident serial killer who believed himself untouchable. As investigators in Brewster struggled to piece together the horrific crime scene, Haddon was already miles away, driving through the New England countryside with Michelle's blood still under his fingernails and her dying screams echoing in his memory. But rather than feeling horror or remorse for what he had done, he experienced something entirely different: a euphoric rush of power and accomplishment that confirmed what he had long suspected about himself. He was born to kill. The weeks following Michelle's murder were intoxicating for Haddon. He devoured newspaper coverage of the crime with the obsessive intensity of a movie star reading his own reviews. Every detail the police released, every theory the investigators proposed, every expression of community shock and grief fed his growing sense of superiority. They were all insects compared to him, bumbling, ineffective creatures who couldn't comprehend the magnificence of what he had accomplished. More importantly, the investigation was going nowhere. The fire had destroyed crucial evidence. The cross-dressing disguise had confused witness accounts, and Haddon's transient lifestyle made him nearly impossible to track. He had committed the perfect murder, and the incompetent authorities didn't even know where to begin looking for him. This realization was like gasoline poured on the flames of his twisted psychology. If he could torture and murder a 6-year-old child in her own bedroom and escape without consequences, what couldn't he do? The fantasies that had sustained him through decades of psychological torment were no longer enough. He needed more victims, more blood, more opportunities to experience the godlike power that came from holding human life in his hands. But Haddon was too intelligent to strike again immediately. He understood that successful serial killers were patient hunters who studied their prey, learned from their mistakes, and evolved their methods with each new kill. Michelle's murder had taught him valuable lessons about timing, technique, and evidence disposal, lessons he was eager to apply to future victims. His next target would be chosen more carefully, killed more efficiently, and disposed of more completely. There would be no more close calls with spreading fires, no more evidence left behind for investigators to analyze, no more amateur mistakes that might compromise his freedom to continue killing. The transformation in Haddon's behavior following Michelle's murder was subtle but significant. Where he had once been anxious and uncertain about his violent fantasies, he now moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered his true purpose in life. His interactions with potential victims became more calculated, his surveillance more methodical, and his planning more sophisticated. He also began experimenting with different approaches to murder. The knife work that had killed Michelle was effective but messy. The blood evidence and defensive wounds she left on his body were complications he needed to avoid in future kills. He started researching cleaner methods of death: strangulation, suffocation, poisoning, and other techniques that would reduce the physical evidence while still allowing him to savor his victims' final moments. The psychological component of murder remained just as important to Haddon as the physical act itself. He needed to see the fear in his victims' eyes, to feel their helplessness, to experience their complete submission to his will. But he also began developing more sophisticated ways to terrorize his victims before killing them. Psychological tortures that would maximize their suffering while minimizing the time needed to complete each murder. His next opportunity came sooner than expected. In November 1986, just 3 months after Michelle's death, Haddon encountered Laura Hodling, a young woman whose terrible luck would make her the second confirmed victim in what would become a decades-long killing spree. Laura was everything Michelle had not been: older, stronger, more worldly, and theoretically better able to defend herself. At 23 years old, she was a recent college graduate working as a secretary while living with her parents in Bethesda, Maryland. She was intelligent, cautious, and aware of the dangers that young women faced in the world. None of it mattered when she crossed paths with Haddon Clark. Their meeting was not accidental. Haddon had been carefully stalking Laura for weeks, learning her routines, identifying her vulnerabilities, and planning his approach with the same methodical precision he had used in Michelle's case. He knew she lived in a well-to-do neighborhood where crime was rare and people felt safe. He knew she often worked late and walked alone to her car in dimly lit parking areas. Most importantly, he knew she was exactly the type of victim who would provide him with the psychological satisfaction he craved. Laura's murder, when it finally came, demonstrated how much Haddon had learned from his previous kill. Gone was the impulsive violence that had nearly exposed him at Michelle's house. In its place was a coldly efficient killing machine that struck with surgical precision and disappeared without a trace. The attack occurred on October 18, 1992, as Laura was leaving her office building after working late on a special project. Haddon had been waiting in the parking garage for over 2 hours, dressed in dark clothing that made him nearly invisible in the shadows between parked cars. He watched her approach with the patience of a predator, noting her hurried pace, her preoccupation with the paperwork she was carrying, and the complete absence of other people in the immediate area. When Laura reached her car and began fumbling with her keys, Haddon struck with lightning speed. One moment she was alone, focused on unlocking her door. The next, a powerful arm had wrapped around her throat from behind while a chemical-soaked cloth covered her nose and mouth. The chloroform, a new addition to his killing kit, took effect within seconds, leaving Laura unconscious and completely helpless. The entire abduction took less than 30 seconds and was executed with such professional efficiency that even security cameras in the area failed to capture clear images of what had happened. One moment Laura Hodling was visible on the footage. The next, she had simply vanished into the darkness. Haddon had prepared extensively for this moment. His vehicle was positioned nearby with the engine running and all interior lights disabled. Laura's unconscious body was quickly transferred into the back seat, covered with a blanket, and secured to prevent any possibility of escape if she regained consciousness during transport. Within minutes, they were driving away from the scene toward a remote location where Haddon could take his time with what came next. The abandoned farmhouse in rural Maryland where Haddon took Laura had been scouted weeks in advance. It was completely isolated, with no neighbors for miles and no chance of being interrupted. The basement had been prepared with restraints, tools, and other equipment needed for the extended torture session Haddon had planned. Unlike Michelle's murder, which had been limited by location and time constraints, Laura's death would be a masterpiece of methodical brutality. When Laura regained consciousness, she found herself chained to a wooden chair in a windowless basement, lit only by a single bare bulb. Her clothes had been removed and replaced with a hospital gown that made her feel even more vulnerable and exposed. Across the room stood a figure she didn't recognize, a slight, unremarkable man who was staring at her with the cold intensity of a scientist observing a laboratory specimen. "You're awake," Haddon said, his voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. "Good. I was worried the chloroform dose might have been too high." Laura's training in self-defense kicked in immediately. She tested her restraints, scanned the room for potential weapons or escape routes, and tried to engage her captor in conversation that might give her information about his intentions or psychological state. But even as her rational mind processed these details, a deeper part of her consciousness was screaming warnings about the true nature of what was happening to her. "Who are you?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What do you want from me?" Haddon's response was to walk slowly around her chair, studying her from different angles like an artist examining a canvas before beginning to paint. His gaze was clinical rather than sexual. He was interested in her fear, her helplessness, and her growing understanding that she was going to die, but not in any conventional sense of physical attraction. "What I want," he said finally, "is to watch you stop being human." The torture that followed lasted for over 6 hours and demonstrated the full evolution of Haddon's killing technique. He had learned from Michelle's case that rushed violence left too much evidence and provided too little satisfaction. Laura's death would be a slow symphony of suffering, with each movement carefully orchestrated to maximize both his pleasure and her pain. He began with psychological torments designed to break down her mental defenses and leave her completely vulnerable to physical attack. He described in clinical detail what he planned to do to her body, how long it would take her to die, and what he would do with her remains afterward. He showed her photographs of Michel Dor's mutilated corpse, explaining his techniques and improvements with the pride of a craftsman discussing his work. "She was my first," he told Laura, holding up one particularly gruesome image. "You're going to help me perfect my art." When Laura began to cry, not from pain but from the hopeless recognition of what was about to happen to her, Haddon's excitement became visibly apparent. Her tears were validation of his power, proof that he had successfully reduced another human being to complete helplessness. It was the psychological component of murder that he found most satisfying, even more than the physical violence that would follow. The actual torture combined techniques Haddon had learned from books, movies, and his own sick imagination. He used knives, but also electrical devices, chemicals, heat, and psychological manipulation to systematically destroy Laura's body and spirit. Each method was applied with scientific precision, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping her conscious and aware of what was happening. Laura fought with incredible courage, refusing to give Haddon the complete submission he craved even as her body was being systematically destroyed. She tried to escape twice, attempted to use psychological tactics to confuse or manipulate her captor, and maintained her essential humanity even in the face of unimaginable torture. Her strength and resilience only made Haddon more determined to break her completely. The end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic compared to the hours of torture that preceded it. Laura died not from any single wound but from the cumulative trauma of systematic brutalization, her body simply giving up after enduring more pain than human physiology could process. Her final expression was one of relief rather than fear. Death had become her escape from suffering. But for Haddon Clark, Laura's death was just the beginning of his interaction with her remains. What he did to her body after she died revealed psychological depths of depravity that challenged even his own understanding of his motivations. The mutilation continued for hours after her death, becoming increasingly bizarre and ritualistic as Haddon explored fantasies that even he had not fully understood before that night. When he was finally satisfied with his handiwork, Haddon began the complex process of evidence disposal that he had planned in advance. Laura's body was dismembered with surgical precision, the parts wrapped in plastic and weighted with concrete blocks. Her remains were scattered across multiple locations, some buried in remote wooded areas, others dropped into deep bodies of water where they would never be recovered. The basement where she had died was thoroughly cleaned with industrial-strength chemicals designed to eliminate any trace of DNA evidence. Every surface was scrubbed, every potential hiding place for forensic material was sterilized, and the entire space was then doused with accelerants and burned to ensure complete evidence destruction. When investigators eventually found the abandoned farmhouse weeks later, they discovered clear signs that it had been used for some terrible purpose, but no physical evidence linking it to Laura Hodling's disappearance or to any specific suspect. Haddon had achieved his goal of committing the perfect murder, leaving behind only questions and the terrible certainty that whoever had killed Laura was still out there. The disappearance of Laura Hodling marked a turning point in Haddon Clark's evolution as a serial killer. He had proven to himself that he could abduct, torture, and murder adult victims just as easily as children. More importantly, he had demonstrated that proper planning and evidence disposal could make him effectively invisible to law enforcement. Over the following years, Haddon would continue to refine his techniques, expand his victim profile, and perfect the art of making people disappear without a trace. Each new murder built upon lessons learned from previous kills, creating an increasingly sophisticated predator who seemed capable of striking anywhere, anytime, without fear of consequences. But Haddon's growing confidence would eventually become his weakness. As his kill count increased and his methods became more elaborate, he would begin making the small mistakes that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The question was not whether he would eventually be caught, but how many more innocent people would die before that day finally arrived. By 1993, Haddon Irving Clark had perfected his craft to a terrifying degree of efficiency. 7 years had passed since Michelle Dorr's murder, and in that time, he had claimed at least 12 confirmed victims, though investigators suspected the actual number was far higher. He had evolved from a bumbling amateur who nearly exposed himself with a poorly planned fire into a methodical killing machine who seemed to vanish like smoke after each attack. But success bred overconfidence, and overconfidence would prove to be his undoing. The beginning of Haddon's downfall came not from brilliant detective work or advanced forensic science, but from the most mundane of circumstances, a routine traffic stop that should have been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. On the evening of September 14, 1993, Maryland State Trooper Jennifer Walsh pulled over a battered Ford pickup truck for speeding on Interstate 270 just outside of Frederick, Maryland. The driver was unremarkable. A thin, nervous man in his early 40s who seemed more annoyed than concerned about the traffic stop. He provided identification showing his name as Haddon Irving Clark, along with a Maryland address that turned out to be a post office box. When Trooper Walsh ran his license through the system, it came back clean. No outstanding warrants, no serious violations, nothing to suggest she was looking at one of America's most dangerous serial killers. What caught her attention instead were the small details that didn't quite add up. Clark's hands were scratched and bandaged, as if he had been in a fight or struggle. His clothing was dirty and disheveled, with what appeared to be dried blood on his shirt sleeves. Most disturbing of all was the smell emanating from his vehicle, a sickly sweet odor that experienced officers learned to recognize as the unmistakable scent of decomposition. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Trooper Walsh said, her hand instinctively moving toward her service weapon. Years of police training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong with this traffic stop. Haddon's reaction was immediate and telling. The casual annoyance disappeared from his face, replaced by the cold, calculating expression of a predator evaluating his options. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, trooper and killer stared at each other through the truck's window, each trying to read the other's intentions. "Is there a problem, officer?" Haddon asked, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one. "I was only going a few miles over the speed limit." But Trooper Walsh was no longer interested in speeding violations. The smell from the truck was growing stronger, and she could see flies buzzing around the vehicle's rear bed. Whatever was causing that odor, it wasn't roadkill or forgotten groceries. It was something that had once been alive and was now very definitely dead. "Step out of the vehicle now, sir," she repeated, this time with the unmistakable authority of a command rather than a request. Her backup was still minutes away, but her training and experience told her that waiting could be fatal, both for her and for whatever victim might be decomposing in the back of Haddon's truck. Haddon's mind raced through his options with the speed of someone who had spent years planning for exactly this scenario. He could comply with the officer's demands and hope that whatever evidence she found wouldn't be enough to hold him. He could attempt to flee, though his old truck was no match for a police cruiser on the open highway. Or he could do what every fiber of his being was urging him to do: eliminate the threat standing between him and continued freedom. The knife was tucked under his driver's seat, within easy reach if he moved quickly enough. Trooper Walsh was young, probably inexperienced, and currently standing in the perfect position for a surprise attack. He could have her throat cut and be back on the road within seconds, leaving behind another body to add to his growing collection. But something held him back, not conscience or moral restraint, but the cold calculation that had kept him free for so many years. Killing a police officer would bring down the full weight of law enforcement on his head, turning him from an invisible predator into the most wanted man in America. The smart play was to cooperate, minimize whatever evidence they found, and trust in the legal system's inability to connect him to his previous crimes. Okay, Haddon said, slowly opening his door and stepping onto the highway's shoulder. "No need to get excited. I'm just trying to get home." The moment Haddon exited his vehicle, Trooper Walsh knew she had stumbled onto something far bigger than a simple traffic violation. Up close, the smell of decomposition was overwhelming, and she could see that his clothes weren't just dirty. They were stained with what appeared to be blood, bodily fluids, and other substances she didn't want to identify. More disturbing still was Haddon's demeanor. Despite the obviously compromising circumstances, he seemed almost relaxed, as if being stopped by police while transporting what smelled like human remains was just another minor inconvenience in his day. His eyes held the flat, emotionless stare she had seen before in the faces of hardcore criminals, people for whom violence and death had become routine. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move away from the vehicle while I take a look inside," Trooper Walsh said, her hand now resting openly on her weapon. "Put your hands where I can see them and walk toward the front of my patrol car." As Haddon complied with her instructions, Trooper Walsh approached the rear of his truck with growing dread. The smell was becoming unbearable, and the buzzing of flies had grown to an audible drone that spoke of something far worse than she had initially imagined. When she finally looked into the truck's bed, what she saw would haunt her dreams for years to come. Wrapped in blood-soaked plastic sheeting were the dismembered remains of what had once been a human being. The body parts were in various stages of decomposition, some relatively fresh while others had clearly been there for days. The methodical way they had been cut and arranged spoke to a killer who took professional pride in his dismemberment technique, someone who had done this many times before and had perfected his methods through repeated practice. But it was the personal effects scattered among the remains that truly drove home the horror of what she was seeing. A woman's purse, its contents spilled across the truck bed. A driver's license bearing the photograph of a young mother who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. Children's toys that suggested this victim had left behind a family who was still waiting for her to come home. "Jesus Christ," Trooper Walsh whispered, fighting back the nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. In 12 years of police work, she had seen traffic fatalities, domestic violence scenes, and other examples of human brutality, but nothing had prepared her for the calculated evil displayed in the back of Haddon Clark's truck. Her radio crackled to life as backup units finally arrived on the scene, their sirens and flashing lights turning the quiet stretch of highway into a law enforcement staging area. As additional officers secured the scene and took Haddon into custody, Trooper Walsh found herself staring at the man who had been casually transporting human remains like bags of garbage. Haddon showed no emotion as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. No fear, no remorse, no recognition that his years of freedom had finally come to an end. Instead, he seemed almost curious about the investigative process unfolding around him, as if he were an observer rather than the primary suspect in what was clearly a horrific homicide. "You have the right to remain silent," the arresting officer began, but Haddon cut him off with a casual wave of his hand. "I know my rights," he said calmly, "and I think you're going to find this case more interesting than you initially thought." Those words would prove to be the understatement of the decade. The investigation that followed Haddon's arrest quickly expanded from a single homicide into what authorities would eventually recognize as one of the most extensive serial killer cases in American history. The victim in his truck was identified as Sarah Chun, a 28-year-old nurse and mother of two who had disappeared while working a late shift at Frederick Memorial Hospital. Her murder bore all the hallmarks of Haddon's previous kills: careful stalking, methodical abduction, prolonged torture, and elaborate evidence disposal. But Sarah Chun was just the beginning. As investigators delved deeper into Haddon's background, a pattern of violence emerged that stretched back decades and spanned multiple states. Storage units rented under false names contained photographs of victims, newspaper clippings about unsolved murders, and detailed journals documenting kills that had never been connected to any suspect. The breakthrough came when detectives matched Haddon's distinctive handwriting to letters sent to police departments in Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia, letters that contained details about unsolved murders that only the killer could have known. In these communications, Haddon had taunted investigators, provided clues about victim locations, and generally demonstrated the superiority complex that had driven him to kill for so many years. "You people are so stupid it's almost boring," read one letter sent to Brewster police after Michelle Dorr's murder. "I could have killed 10 more children in the time it's taken you to realize you're not even looking for the right kind of suspect. The little girl begged for her mommy before she died. I thought you might want to know that." Another letter, sent to Maryland authorities after Laura Hodling's disappearance, was even more chilling. "She lasted 6 hours before her heart gave out. I'm getting better at keeping them alive longer. Practice makes perfect, as they say. You'll never find all the pieces, but I'll give you a hint. Check the water." The letters were a goldmine of information that allowed investigators to connect Haddon to crimes spanning 3 decades. But more importantly, they revealed the psychological profile of a killer who viewed his victims as nothing more than objects for his entertainment. Human beings reduced to props in his twisted fantasy life. As the investigation expanded, more victims were identified through DNA evidence, dental records, and personal effects found in Haddon's various hideouts. The confirmed victim count eventually reached 17, though investigators suspected the actual number was much higher. Many of his early kills had been so thoroughly destroyed that no physical evidence remained, leaving only gaps in the timeline where people had disappeared without explanation. The geographic scope of Haddon's killing spree was staggering. He had murdered victims in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, following a pattern that suggested he deliberately targeted different jurisdictions to prevent investigators from recognizing the connections between crimes. His transient lifestyle and use of false identities had made him nearly impossible to track, allowing him to kill with impunity for years. But perhaps most disturbing were the photographs and videos investigators found in his personal collection, documentation of tortures and murders that revealed the true scope of Haddon's depravity. These materials showed not just the physical brutality he inflicted on his victims, but the psychological pleasure he derived from their suffering. He had recorded their final moments not as evidence of his crimes, but as entertainment for his own twisted enjoyment. "This is evil in its purest form," said FBI profiler Dr. Patricia Williams, who worked on the case. "Clark didn't kill because of childhood trauma, mental illness, or external pressures. He killed because he enjoyed it and he was very, very good at it. If that traffic stop hadn't happened, he could have continued indefinitely." The trial of Haddon Irving Clark began on March 15, 1994, and immediately captured national attention. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence: DNA, fingerprints, photographic documentation, written confessions, and witness testimony that painted a picture of systematic brutality spanning decades. The defense's only strategy was to argue for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, acknowledging their client's guilt while attempting to avoid execution. But Haddon had other plans for his moment in the spotlight. On the third day of testimony, as prosecutors were presenting evidence about Michelle Dorr's murder, Haddon suddenly stood up in the courtroom and began speaking directly to the judge and jury. His words would become some of the most chilling statements ever recorded in American legal proceedings. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the same flat emotionlessness that had characterized all his interactions with authorities. "I'm not sorry for what I did. I'm not mentally ill. I'm not a victim of circumstances beyond my control. I killed those people because I wanted to, and I enjoyed every second of it." The courtroom fell silent as Haddon continued his spontaneous confession, providing details about murders that investigators hadn't even connected to him yet. He spoke about his victims with the clinical detachment of a scientist discussing laboratory specimens, describing their final moments with a level of detail that left hardened prosecutors struggling to maintain their composure. "The little girl in Massachusetts, Michelle, she wet herself when she saw the knife," Haddon said, staring directly at the jury box. "That's when I knew I had found my calling. The power over life and death, the ability to reduce human beings to animals begging for mercy. There's nothing else like it in the world." He went on to describe Laura Hodling's 6-hour torture session, Sarah Chen's final moments, and murders that investigators hadn't yet discovered. Each revelation brought fresh horror to the proceedings, but also provided closure for families who had spent years wondering what had happened to their missing loved ones. "I could have kept going forever," Haddon concluded. "If that stupid trooper hadn't pulled me over, I'd still be out there. You people never would have caught me on your own. You're all too inferior to understand how my mind works." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Catherine Morrison, in sentencing Haddon to death, made a statement that captured the feelings of everyone who had been touched by the case. "Mr. Clark, you represent evil in its most concentrated form. You have shown no remorse for your actions, no recognition of the humanity of your victims, and no indication that you would ever stop killing if given the opportunity. This court sentences you to death, not out of vengeance, but out of recognition that some crimes are so heinous that they require the ultimate penalty." Haddon's response was a slight smile, the first genuine emotion he had shown throughout the entire proceedings. The appeals process that followed would drag on for years, with various legal challenges attempting to overturn Haddon's death sentence based on questions of mental competency, trial procedures, and constitutional issues. Each appeal was ultimately rejected, but the delays meant that Haddon would spend over a decade on death row before his sentence was finally carried out. During those years of appeals, investigators continued working to identify additional victims and provide closure for families whose loved ones had disappeared during Haddon's killing spree. Advanced DNA testing techniques allowed them to connect him to several more murders, bringing his confirmed victim count to 23 by the time of his execution. But Haddon never provided complete cooperation with these ongoing investigations. He seemed to enjoy withholding information about potential victims, using his knowledge as leverage in appeals and legal proceedings. Even facing death, he maintained the psychological control that had driven him to kill for so many years. The execution of Haddon Irving Clark took place on October 12, 2006, at the Maryland State Penitentiary in Baltimore. He declined to make a final statement, refused the traditional last meal, and showed no emotion as the lethal injection procedure began. According to witnesses, his last words were spoken to the prison chaplain. "I wish I had killed more of them." Haddon Clark died at 12:17 a.m., bringing to an end one of the most prolific and disturbing serial killing sprees in American history. But even his death didn't provide complete closure for the case. Investigators estimated that he may have been responsible for as many as 50 murders during his decades-long career, many of which would never be solved due to his efficient evidence disposal methods. The legacy of Haddon Clark's crimes extends far beyond the individual victims he claimed. His case led to improvements in interjurisdictional law enforcement cooperation, advances in forensic evidence analysis, and changes in how missing person investigations are conducted. Police departments across the country now recognize the patterns that might indicate a serial killer operating across multiple jurisdictions. But perhaps most importantly, Haddon's case serves as a reminder of the evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary people. He lived among his victims, worked in their neighborhoods, and appeared to be nothing more than a harmless drifter. The terrible truth was that behind his unremarkable exterior lurked a predator who viewed human beings as objects to be tortured and discarded for his personal entertainment. The families of his victims have found different ways to cope with their losses and the knowledge of how their loved ones died. Some have become advocates for victims' rights, working to improve support services for families of violent crime victims. Others have retreated from public attention, choosing to grieve privately while trying to rebuild their shattered lives. Michelle Dorr's parents, Robert and Donna, eventually established a foundation in their daughter's memory that provides safety education for children and support for families affected by violent crime. "We can't bring Michelle back," Donna said in a rare public statement, "but we can try to prevent other families from experiencing what we've been through." Laura Hodling's mother became a vocal advocate for death penalty reform, arguing that even monsters like Haddon Clark deserve to face justice through legal proceedings rather than state-sanctioned execution. "Nothing will bring Laura back," she said, "but becoming killers ourselves doesn't honor her memory." The abandoned farmhouse where Laura died was eventually demolished, but not before becoming an unofficial pilgrimage site for people fascinated by serial killer cases. Local authorities had to post security guards to prevent curiosity seekers from removing souvenirs or contaminating what remained of the crime scene. Today, more than 15 years after Haddon Clark's execution, his case continues to be studied by law enforcement professionals, criminologists, and forensic psychologists seeking to understand the mind of a serial killer. His journals, photographs, and recorded confessions provide a unique window into the psychological development of someone who chose evil as a way of life. But perhaps the most important lesson of Haddon Clark's story is the simplest. Evil exists, it can emerge from the most unlikely sources, and it requires constant vigilance to prevent it from claiming more innocent victims. The men and women who work in law enforcement, the families who refuse to give up searching for missing loved ones, and the communities that refuse to let fear control their lives. They are the true heroes in this story. Michelle Dorr would have been 43 years old today. Laura Hodling would have been 54. Sarah Chen's children are now adults with families of their own, growing up with only photographs and stories to remember their mother. The other victims, some identified, some still unknown, left behind their own legacies of love, loss, and the enduring question of what they might have accomplished if they had been allowed to live. Haddon Irving Clark took their lives, but he could not take their humanity. In the end, that may be the most important victory of all, that his victims are remembered not as objects of his twisted pleasure, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that befell them. The Fire Murders case is officially closed, but its impact will continue to ripple through American law enforcement and criminal justice for generations to come. And somewhere in the darkness, other predators are watching, learning, and planning their own campaigns of terror, secure in the knowledge that evil, once awakened, never truly dies. It only waits for its next opportunity to strike. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Giggling Granny, America's most chilling serial killer. Behind the gentle facade of a grandmother's smile lurked one of America's most terrifying predators. For decades, she moved like a shadow through small towns, leaving behind a trail of corpses that would make seasoned detectives question their faith in humanity. Her weapon of choice? Not a blade or bullet, but something far more insidious. A poison so deadly it turned family dinners into funeral preparations. Nanny Doss didn't just kill. She obliterated entire bloodlines while giggling at their funerals. This is the bone-chilling story of the woman who turned motherhood into murder, love into a death sentence, and domestic bliss into a nightmare that haunted America for over 3 decades. What you're about to hear will forever change how you view that sweet old lady next door. The year was 1905 when Nancy Hazel drew her first breath in Blue Mountain, Alabama, a breath that would later be used to blow kisses goodbye to 11 victims. But in those early moments, as her mother cradled what appeared to be an innocent newborn, nobody could have predicted that this child would grow into one of America's most prolific female serial killers. The Hazel household was a breeding ground for violence and despair. James Hazel, Nancy's father, ruled his domain with iron fists and volcanic rage. His children lived in perpetual terror, never knowing when his shadow would darken their doorway, bringing with it the promise of brutal punishment. The walls of their ramshackle home seemed to absorb the screams, the sobs, the desperate pleas for mercy that echoed through the nights. Nancy's mother, a broken woman whose spirit had been systematically crushed under her husband's tyrannical reign, offered little protection to her children. She moved through their house like a ghost, her eyes hollow and distant, her voice rarely rising above a whisper. In this toxic environment, where love was a foreign concept and survival was the only goal, Nancy learned her first and most crucial lesson. Power came through control, and control came through fear. The pivotal moment that would forever alter Nancy's psychological landscape occurred when she was just 7 years old. During a family train ride to visit relatives, a catastrophic accident sent their car tumbling off the tracks. The twisted metal screamed as it scraped against the earth, and Nancy's small body was thrown violently against the interior of the car. When she finally stopped moving, blood trickled from a severe head injury that would leave her unconscious for hours. The doctors, with their limited understanding of brain trauma in 1912, declared her lucky to be alive. They bandaged her wounds, prescribed rest, and sent her home, never suspecting that the injury had fundamentally rewired her brain. From that day forward, Nancy began experiencing violent headaches that felt like lightning splitting her skull open. These episodes would send her into fits of rage so intense that her family learned to flee when they saw the telltale signs approaching. But more disturbing than the headaches were the blackouts. Periods where Nancy would disappear entirely from her own consciousness, only to return to find herself in strange places with no memory of how she'd arrived. During these episodes, neighbors reported seeing her standing motionless in fields, staring at nothing with an expression so vacant and unsettling that children would run crying to their mothers. As Nancy entered adolescence, her behavior became increasingly erratic and predatory. She developed an obsession with death that manifested in deeply disturbing ways. Neighborhood pets began disappearing, only to be found days later in various states of decay, often arranged in grotesque positions that suggested deliberate manipulation. When questioned about these discoveries, Nancy would respond with a giggle, a sound that would later become her signature, chilling those who heard it to their very core. Her fascination with mortality extended to humans as well. She would spend hours at the local cemetery, not in quiet reflection, but studying headstones with the intensity of a scholar. She memorized dates, calculated ages at death, and began keeping a morbid journal where she recorded her observations about the deceased. In her childish handwriting, she would note things like, "Mrs. Patterson died at 34, heart gave out after her baby died," or "Old man Morris lasted 67 years before the cancer ate him alive." School became another battlefield where Nancy's disturbing nature revealed itself. Teachers reported that she showed no empathy when classmates were hurt or upset. Instead, she would watch their pain with fascination, sometimes even smiling when others cried. Her academic performance was mediocre at best, but she excelled in one particular area that should have raised red flags. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of plants and their properties, particularly those that could cause harm. During a botany lesson, when the teacher warned students about poisonous plants in their area, Nancy's hand shot up with question after question. How much would it take to make someone sick? How long before the symptoms start? Would they know they'd been poisoned? Her queries were so detailed and persistent that the teacher later confided to the principal that something about Nancy Hazel made her skin crawl. By the time Nancy reached her 15th birthday, her transformation was complete. The head injury, the brutal upbringing, and her own twisted psychology had combined to create something monstrous. She had learned to mask her true nature behind a facade of sweetness, perfecting the art of appearing harmless while harboring thoughts of unimaginable darkness. The year 1921 marked the beginning of Nanny Doss's killing spree, though at the time, nobody suspected that the blushing 16-year-old bride walking down the aisle was actually death incarnate in a wedding dress. Her groom, Charlie Braggs, not to be confused with her earlier boyfriend Charlie, stood waiting at the altar, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant by saying, "I do." Charlie was everything Nancy appeared to want in a husband: hardworking, devoted, and tragically trusting. He worked long. When he confronted her, Nancy's demeanor shifted instantly to that of a heartbroken mother. But Charlie couldn't shake the image of what he'd seen in her eyes. It was hunger, not for food, but for something far more disturbing. She was feeding off the infant's pain, drawing some perverse satisfaction from watching a helpless life slip away. The baby's death followed the same pattern as the first, and once again, Nancy's performance at the funeral was flawless. She collapsed dramatically at the graveside, had to be supported by friends, and spoke movingly about God's plan and the comfort of knowing her babies were in heaven. But that night, Charlie heard something that made his soul freeze. Nancy was in the kitchen, humming cheerfully while preparing supper, as if she hadn't buried a child that very day. Charlie's suspicions were growing, but he was trapped by the social conventions of the time. Accusing your wife of murdering your children was unthinkable, especially when she appeared to be as grief-stricken as any mother would be. He began watching her more carefully, documenting behaviors that seemed increasingly abnormal. Nancy had developed a routine around death that was both meticulous and chilling. She would prepare special meals during the final days of her victims' lives, meals that she claimed would help them feel better. These dishes were always prepared in private, with Nancy shooing away any offers of help. She would taste test everything multiple times, claiming she wanted to make sure the seasoning was perfect for her sick loved ones. But Charlie noticed that Nancy never actually ate these special meals herself. She would prepare a separate plate, claiming she was too worried to eat or that her grief had stolen her appetite. When pressed to try just a bite of the food she'd prepared for the sick family member, she would always find an excuse: a sudden headache, an upset stomach, or an urgent need to check on the patient. The surviving daughters, Melvina and Florine, were beginning to show signs of the psychological damage inflicted by growing up in a house where death was a frequent visitor. Melvina, the older of the two, developed an extreme fear of her mother's cooking. She would refuse to eat anything Nancy prepared unless someone else tried it first. This behavior was dismissed by relatives as childhood pickiness, but Melvina's instincts were actually keeping her alive. Florine, younger and more trusting, didn't develop the same survival instincts. She would eat whatever her mother gave her, which led to frequent illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. These episodes would leave her weak and disoriented for days, during which Nancy would hover over her with what appeared to be loving concern but was actually predatory anticipation. As the years passed, Charlie's health began to deteriorate in ways that mirrored his deceased children's final days. He started experiencing severe stomach pains after meals, particularly those prepared specially by Nancy during times when he was under the weather. She would bring him soup in bed, insisting he needed to keep his strength up, and then watch with barely concealed excitement as he doubled over in agony minutes later. The pattern was always the same. Nancy would express concern, suggest a special remedy or meal, prepare it in private, and then observe the results with clinical detachment masked by apparent worry. She was perfecting her technique, learning exactly how much poison to use to cause maximum suffering without immediately killing her victim. The prolonged agony seemed to be part of her enjoyment. She fed off the fear in her victims' eyes as they realized something was terribly wrong but couldn't understand what. Charlie's final weeks were a nightmare of escalating torment. Nancy had apparently decided it was time to end their marriage permanently. and she began administering larger doses of whatever deadly concoction she had perfected. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his body on fire from within, gasping for breath while his wife sat beside him with a cold cloth, murmuring words of comfort that sounded more like threats. During his last coherent moments, Charlie tried to warn his daughters about their mother. He pulled Melvina aside and whispered urgently about the dangers lurking in their own home. But his words were dismissed as the ravings of a dying man, and Nancy was there to provide comfort and assurance that Daddy wasn't thinking clearly because of his illness. When Charlie finally died in 1927, after days of convulsions and screaming that could be heard throughout the neighborhood, Nancy's performance reached new heights of theatrical brilliance. She threw herself across his body, wailing about losing the love of her life, clutching his lifeless hand as if she could bring him back through sheer force of will. The neighbors were moved by her grief, bringing casseroles and offering to help with the children. But that same night, after the visitors had gone home and the children were asleep, Nancy did something that would have revealed her true nature to anyone who witnessed it. She returned to Charlie's body and whispered things to his corpse that would have made seasoned morticians vomit. She thanked him for being such a good test subject, praised him for lasting longer than the babies, and promised that his death had taught her valuable lessons she would use on her next husband. The funeral was another masterclass in deception. Nancy played the role of the devastated widow so convincingly that several women in the community later said they'd never seen such genuine grief. She spoke beautifully about Charlie's devotion to his family, his hard work, and his gentle nature. She collapsed twice during the service and had to be revived with smelling salts, creating a scene so dramatic that it overshadowed any questions about the suspicious timing of so many deaths in one household. With Charlie buried and the life insurance money in her account, Nancy began planning her next move. She had learned valuable lessons from her first marriage: choose victims who trusted her completely, isolate them from potential help, and always maintain the perfect facade of loving concern. She had also discovered something crucial about her own psychology. She needed the killing. It wasn't just about money or freedom. It was about the power, the control, the intoxicating rush of watching life drain from someone's eyes while they still believed she was trying to save them. The death count was now at 4, but Nancy was just getting started. She had perfected her methods, refined her acting skills, and developed an insatiable appetite for murder that would drive her to kill again and again over the next 3 decades. The giggling granny had claimed her first family, and she was already hungry for more. As she tucked her surviving daughters into bed that night, Nancy hummed a cheerful tune while mentally planning her next marriage. She had learned that husbands were the most satisfying victims because they trusted her completely, gave her access to their finances, and provided the perfect cover for her activities. Society expected wives to care for their sick husbands, which meant she could torture them for weeks without arousing suspicion. The nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Nancy had discovered her true calling, and she would spend the next 27 years perfecting the art of murder, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would eventually catch the attention of investigators and horrify an entire nation. But for now, she was simply a young widow with 2 small children, ready to find love again and ready to kill again. By 1929, Nancy Doss had transformed herself from a grieving widow into a predatory huntress, prowling the matrimonial landscape with the calculated precision of a spider weaving its web. Her next victim would be Frank Harrelson, a man whose only crime was believing in the possibility of love at second sight. What he got instead was a front-row seat to hell, delivered with a smile and seasoned with arsenic. Frank was everything Nancy had learned to look for in prey. Recently widowed, financially stable, and desperately lonely. She met him through a Lonely Hearts advertisement, a relatively new phenomenon that provided perfect hunting grounds for predators like Nancy. Her letter to him was a masterpiece of manipulation, filled with references to faith, family values, and the sacred bonds of marriage. She painted herself as a simple woman seeking companionship, someone who understood the pain of loss and wanted nothing more than to create a loving home. Their courtship was a textbook example of psychological grooming. Nancy presented herself as the perfect wife material. She could cook, clean, manage household finances, and most importantly, She understood a man's needs. She spoke lovingly about her deceased husband, claiming their marriage had been the happiest years of her life and expressing her desire to recreate that bliss with the right man. Frank, starved for affection and companionship, fell completely under her spell. The wedding in 1929 was a modest affair, but Nancy played her role perfectly. She glowed with apparent happiness, spoke emotionally about second chances, and promised to love and cherish Frank until death did them part. The irony of those vows would become clear soon enough. Death would indeed part them, but it would be Nancy holding the scythe. Frank's introduction to Nancy's household was his first glimpse into the twisted dynamic she had created. Her daughters, Melvina and Florine, now 7 and 5 respectively, were unnaturally quiet around their mother. They spoke in whispers, moved carefully through the house as if afraid of disturbing something dangerous, and showed signs of chronic anxiety that Frank attributed to the trauma of losing their father so young. What Frank didn't realize was that these children were living in a state of perpetual terror, having witnessed more death and suffering than most adults would see in a lifetime. They had learned to recognize the signs of their mother's special cooking and had developed survival strategies that kept them alive while others perished around them. Melvina, in particular, had become expert at finding excuses not to eat her mother's food, claiming stomachaches or lack of appetite whenever Nancy prepared her deadly concoctions. The first year of marriage gave Frank a false sense of security. Nancy was an attentive wife, keeping the house spotless, preparing elaborate meals, and showing genuine affection, or at least what appeared to be genuine affection. She would massage his shoulders after long days at work, bring him coffee in bed, and listen with apparent fascination to his stories about his job at the lumber mill. But Nancy was actually studying him during this honeymoon period, learning his habits, his preferences, his weaknesses. She noted that he liked to have a drink before dinner, that he trusted her completely with the household finances, and most importantly, that he had no close family members who might ask uncomfortable questions if something happened to him. Frank was isolated, dependent on her for domestic comfort, and completely unaware that he was being evaluated like a laboratory specimen. The killing began in earnest during their second year of marriage. Nancy had grown bored with the pretense of domestic bliss and was hungry for the thrill that only murder could provide. But this time, she decided to experiment with different approaches, turning Frank's death into an extended project that would allow her to explore various methods of inflicting suffering. She started with psychological torture, slowly poisoning Frank's mind along with his body. She would prepare 2 versions of the same meal, one for herself and the children, and a special version for Frank that contained just enough toxin to make him feel unwell without immediately killing him. When he complained of stomach pains or dizziness, she would express concern while inwardly documenting his symptoms with scientific precision. Nancy's method was diabolical in its subtlety. She would go through periods of apparent normalcy, during which Frank would feel fine and begin to believe his health problems were behind him. Then she would strike again, administering another dose that would send him into convulsions of agony. This cycle of relief and torment was designed to maximize his suffering while maintaining her facade of being a loving, concerned wife. During Frank's sick spells, Nancy would hover over him with apparent devotion, bringing him special teas and broths that she claimed would help him feel better. These concoctions were actually carefully calibrated doses of poison, designed to prolong his agony while slowly shutting down his organs. She would sit beside his bed for hours, ostensibly nursing him back to health, but actually watching with fascination as the poison did its work. Frank's co-workers at the lumber mill began to notice changes in his appearance and demeanor. He had lost significant weight, his skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and he seemed to be in constant pain. When they expressed concern, Frank would always defend Nancy, praising her devotion and claiming he didn't know how he would survive without her care. The irony was lost on him. He was literally not surviving with her care. Nancy's daughters were forced to witness their stepfather's slow destruction, adding another layer of trauma to their already damaged psyches. They watched Frank stumble through the house, doubled over in pain, while their mother followed behind with false expressions of concern. Melvina, now old enough to understand what was happening, tried to warn Frank by refusing to eat meals her mother prepared for him. But her subtle attempts at protection were dismissed as childhood stubbornness. As Frank's condition deteriorated, Nancy began preparing for his death with the same meticulous planning she had used for her previous victims. She researched local doctors who might be called to examine the body, learning their reputations and their likelihood to ask uncomfortable questions. She practiced her grieving widow routine in front of mirrors, perfecting the right combination of devastation and brave acceptance. The final phase of Frank's murder was a crescendo of calculated cruelty. Nancy increased the frequency and potency of her poisoning, pushing his body to the very limits of endurance before finally administering the killing dose. She timed it perfectly. Frank died on a Saturday night when no doctor would be readily available for an extensive examination, making it easier to attribute his death to his ongoing health problems. Frank's last moments were a nightmare of pain and confusion. He lay in bed, his body racked with convulsions, while Nancy sat beside him making soothing sounds. But witnesses later recalled that her eyes never showed the concern her voice conveyed. Instead, there was that same hungry gleam that had appeared during her children's deaths, the look of someone feeding off another's suffering. As Frank took his final breath, Nancy began her now familiar performance. She screamed his name, shook his body as if trying to wake him, and collapsed dramatically beside the bed. Neighbors who heard her cries rushed over to find her cradling Frank's lifeless form, weeping uncontrollably and moaning about losing another beloved husband to cruel fate. The funeral was another triumph of deceptive theater. Nancy spoke movingly about Frank's kindness, his devotion to her and the children, and the cruelty of losing two husbands while still so young. She accepted condolences with dignified grief, spoke about God's mysterious plans, and impressed everyone with her strength in the face of such tragedy. But even as mourners offered their sympathy, some were beginning to whisper among themselves. It seemed remarkably unlucky for one woman to lose two husbands in such similar circumstances. Both had died after prolonged illnesses that doctors couldn't quite diagnose. Both had suffered from the same mysterious symptoms, and both had died while under Nancy's devoted care. These whispers might have grown into suspicions, but Nancy had already begun planning her next move. She had learned from Frank's death that she needed to vary her methods and locations to avoid drawing attention. She also realized that the stress of prolonged murder was taking its toll on her daughters, who were becoming increasingly difficult to control and might eventually say something that could expose her. With Frank's life insurance money in hand and his body safely buried, Nancy began making plans to relocate. She told neighbors that staying in the house where Frank had died was too painful, and that she needed a fresh start for herself and the children. The community rallied around the tragic young widow, helping her pack and offering prayers for her future happiness. What they were actually doing was enabling a serial killer to escape justice and find new hunting grounds. Nancy had murdered for people, 2 infant children and 2 husbands, and gotten away with it completely. She had refined her methods, perfected her acting skills, and developed an appetite for killing that was growing stronger with each victim. As she loaded her belongings into a wagon and prepared to leave town, Nancy was already mentally composing her next Lonely Hearts advertisement. She had learned that marriage was the perfect cover for murder, providing her with isolated victims who trusted her completely while giving her access to their finances and property. The giggling granny was becoming a more sophisticated predator, and her reign of terror was far from over. The road ahead would lead to new towns, new victims, and new opportunities to indulge her homicidal desires. Nancy Doss was transforming into one of America's most prolific serial killers, leaving behind a trail of bodies that stretched across multiple states and spanned more than 3 decades. But for now, she was simply a grieving widow seeking a new beginning, with no one suspecting that wherever she went, death was sure to follow. By 1953, Nancy Doss had perfected her craft to a deadly art form that would have impressed Renaissance masters, if Renaissance masters had specialized in systematic murder. Over the span of 24 years, she had moved through victims like a plague, leaving behind a trail of corpses that stretched across multiple states. But her final chapter would begin in Kansas, where she would encounter the man who would ultimately lead to her downfall. Samuel Doss, husband number 5 and victim number 11. Samuel was a Methodist minister, a detail that added a particularly twisted dimension to Nancy's final hunt. She had found him through another Lonely Hearts correspondence, and their courtship had followed her now-perfected pattern of manipulation and false intimacy. Samuel was drawn to Nancy's apparent devotion to faith, her tragic history of loss, and her desire to find spiritual companionship in her golden years. What he got instead was a front-row seat to hell, delivered by a woman who quoted scripture while measuring out arsenic. The Doss household in Tulsa, Oklahoma, became Nancy's most sophisticated killing ground yet. She had learned from decades of murder how to create the perfect environment for her crimes. Isolated from neighbors, financially controlled, and filled with potential victims who trusted her completely. Samuel's extended family provided her with a buffet of targets, each presenting unique opportunities for her to explore different methods of inflicting death. Nancy's first victim in the Doss family was Samuel's mother, an elderly woman whose only crime was expressing mild disapproval of her son's new wife. The old woman had noticed things about Nancy that made her uncomfortable. The way Nancy's eyes would go cold when she thought no one was looking, the strange giggle that would escape her lips at inappropriate moments, and most disturbingly, her intense interest in the family's wills and insurance policies. The elderly Mrs. Doss's murder was a masterclass in patient cruelty. Nancy began with small doses of poison administered through the old woman's morning coffee, just enough to cause weakness and confusion that could be attributed to advancing age. As the symptoms progressed, Nancy positioned herself as the devoted daughter-in-law, insisting that she would personally care for the ailing woman despite the burden it placed on her own health. Samuel was moved by his wife's apparent sacrifice, praising her devotion and expressing gratitude for her willingness to care for his mother. He had no idea that Nancy was actually conducting a prolonged experiment in geriatric murder, carefully documenting how an elderly body responded to various toxins and using his mother as a test subject for techniques she might use on him later. The old woman's death throes lasted for weeks, during which Nancy attended to her with theatrical devotion while internally savoring every moment of suffering. She would sit beside the bed for hours, holding the dying woman's hand while whispering what sounded like prayers, but were actually detailed descriptions of the poison coursing through her victim's veins. The elderly Mrs. Doss died in agony, never understanding why her body was betraying her so completely. Nancy's performance at the funeral was her most accomplished yet. She spoke movingly about the privilege of caring for Samuel's mother, claimed the old woman had become like her own mother, and broke down dramatically while describing her final moments. The congregation was deeply moved by her apparent grief, and Samuel was more convinced than ever that he had married a saint. But Nancy wasn't finished with the Doss family tree. Samuel's younger sister, who had come to help during their mother's illness, had also begun expressing concerns about Nancy's behavior. She had noticed that family members only became sick when Nancy prepared special meals for them, and she had started documenting these patterns in a diary that she kept hidden in her bedroom. Nancy discovered the diary during one of her methodical searches through the house, searches that she conducted whenever family members were away, ostensibly to organize and clean, but actually to gather intelligence about potential threats to her activities. The diary contained observations that could have exposed Nancy's entire operation, including detailed notes about family members' symptoms and their correlation with Nancy's cooking. The sister's murder was swift and brutal compared to Nancy's usual methods. She couldn't risk allowing the woman to share her suspicions with Samuel or other family members, so she administered a massive dose of rat poison mixed into a birthday cake she prepared for a family celebration. The entire family ate the cake, but only the sister's slice contained enough poison to be immediately fatal. The death was attributed to a sudden heart attack, a diagnosis that Nancy helped establish by describing the victim's apparent chest pains and difficulty breathing in the moments before her collapse. She performed CPR with dramatic intensity, screaming for someone to call a doctor while internally celebrating another successful kill. The sister died before medical help could arrive, taking her dangerous knowledge to the grave. Samuel was devastated by his sister's sudden death so soon after losing his mother, and Nancy positioned herself as his sole source of emotional support during this dark period. She encouraged him to depend on her completely, gradually isolating him from other family members and friends who might notice changes in his behavior or health. She was preparing him for his own murder, creating the perfect conditions for an extended killing that would provide her with maximum satisfaction. The final phase of Nancy's killing spree began with Samuel's niece and nephew, who had come to live with them after being orphaned in a car accident. Nancy saw these children as both obstacles to her complete control over Samuel and opportunities to perfect her techniques on younger victims. She had always found particular satisfaction in killing children, perhaps because their innocence made their betrayal more complete. The nephew was the first to go, succumbing to what appeared to be a severe case of food poisoning after eating one of Nancy's special meals. The boy spent his final days in excruciating pain, his small body racked with convulsions while Nancy sat beside him with false expressions of maternal concern. She would stroke his hair and sing lullabies while he suffered, feeding off his agony like a psychic vampire. The niece survived longer than her brother, perhaps because Nancy wanted to experiment with different dosages and methods. The child endured weeks of mysterious illnesses that would come and go without explanation, always coinciding with Nancy's helpful attempts to nurse her back to health. Eventually, Nancy grew bored with the prolonged torture and administered the killing dose, watching with satisfaction as the little girl slipped into a coma from which she would never wake. Samuel was now isolated and vulnerable, surrounded only by Nancy and consumed by grief over the loss of so many family members in such a short period. Nancy comforted him during this dark time, suggesting that perhaps God was testing their faith by taking their loved ones. She spoke about the importance of trusting in divine providence and finding strength in each other, all while planning his murder with meticulous precision. Samuel's death would be Nancy's masterpiece, the culmination of decades of killing and the final expression of her homicidal artistry. She had decided to make it last for months, creating a prolonged symphony of suffering that would provide her with maximum satisfaction. But this time, her hubris would prove to be her downfall. Nancy's mistake was her confidence in her own invincibility. After getting away with murder for over 30 years, she had become careless about covering her tracks. She began administering poison to Samuel with increasing boldness, no longer bothering to hide her activities or create plausible explanations for his symptoms. Her giggling became more frequent and less controlled, sometimes escaping her lips even when others were present. Samuel's death, when it finally came in October 1954, was accompanied by symptoms so severe and unusual that the attending physician became suspicious. Unlike the small-town doctors who had examined Nancy's previous victims, Dr. Michael Foster was young, well-trained, and familiar with toxicology. He noticed inconsistencies between Samuel's reported symptoms and his actual condition, and he made the decision that would finally bring Nancy's killing spree to an end. He ordered an autopsy. The post-mortem examination revealed massive levels of arsenic in Samuel's system, enough to kill a horse, let alone a 60-year-old man. The concentration was so high that it could only have been administered deliberately and repeatedly over an extended period. Dr. Foster immediately contacted the police, setting in motion the investigation that would finally expose the giggling granny's decades-long reign of terror. Detective Ray Page was assigned to the case, and what he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his career. As he began digging into Nancy's background, a pattern of death and destruction emerged that defied belief. Everywhere Nancy had lived, people had died under suspicious circumstances. Husbands, children, relatives, friends. Anyone who got close to Nancy Doss seemed to develop mysterious illnesses that inevitably proved fatal. The investigation revealed the full scope of Nancy's crimes. 11 confirmed murders spanning over 30 years, with several arsenic, strychnine, and plant-based toxins, and explained her methods with disturbing pride. She had kept detailed mental notes about each killing, remembering exactly how much poison she had used and how long it had taken her victims to die. But perhaps most disturbing was Nancy's explanation for why she had killed. When asked about her motives, she simply said that she had grown bored with her victims and wanted to move on to new relationships. The murders weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated decisions made by someone who viewed human life as disposable entertainment. She had killed 11 people simply because she had grown tired of them, the way others might discard an old dress or trade in a used car. The trial of Nancy Doss became a media sensation, drawing reporters from across the country who struggled to comprehend how a grandmother could commit such horrific crimes. Nancy seemed to enjoy the attention, often giggling during the proceedings and making jokes with reporters during breaks. She showed no remorse for her victims, no understanding of the pain she had caused, and no concern for her own fate. The prosecution painted a picture of a predator who had used society's expectations about women and grandmothers to shield herself from suspicion. Nancy had exploited the trust that people naturally placed in maternal figures, turning that trust into a weapon more deadly than any gun or knife. She had killed with impunity for decades because no one could imagine that someone who looked so harmless could harbor such evil. The defense attempted to argue that Nancy was insane, pointing to her childhood head injury and the abuse she had suffered as potential explanations for her behavior. But the prosecution countered with evidence of her careful planning, her methodical approach to murder, and her ability to maintain a normal facade for years at a time. Nancy Doss wasn't insane. She was evil in its purest form. On June 2, 1955, Nancy Doss was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read her sentence, she giggled one final time, a sound that would echo in the nightmares of everyone who heard it. She was led away in handcuffs, still smiling, still finding amusement in the chaos and pain she had caused. Nancy spent her remaining years in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where she became something of a celebrity among the other inmates. She would regale them with stories of her murders, describing her victims' final moments with the same casual tone others might use to discuss the weather. She never expressed remorse, never showed any understanding of the gravity of her crimes, and continued to giggle at inappropriate moments until the day she died. The giggling granny's reign of terror finally ended on June 2, 1965, exactly 10 years after her sentencing, when she died of leukemia in the prison hospital. Even in death, she remained unrepentant, spending her final moments complaining about the quality of the hospital food and making dark jokes about the irony of dying from natural causes after poisoning so many others. Nancy Doss's legacy is one of pure evil disguised by maternal warmth, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. She proved that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most harmless, who exploit our trust and use our compassion against us. Her story serves as a chilling warning about the evil that can lurk behind the most innocent facades. The families she destroyed, the children she orphaned, the community she terrorized, all bear the scars of her decades-long killing spree. The giggling granny may be dead, but the nightmare she created lives on in the memories of those who survived her, a testament to the capacity for evil that exists in the human heart. In the end, Nancy Doss was exactly what she appeared to be from the very beginning. Death itself, wearing a grandmother's smile and humming lullabies while the world burned around her. She was the monster that every parent warns their children about, the evil that hides in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare and theatrics. Sometimes it comes quietly, with a warm smile and a plate of homemade cookies. Sometimes it wears the face of someone we trust, someone we love, someone we would never suspect of harboring such darkness. Nancy Doss, the giggling granny, America's most unlikely serial killer, had finally been stopped. But the echoes of her laughter and the memory of her crimes would haunt the collective consciousness forever. A chilling reminder that the greatest monsters are often those who hide behind the masks we least expect to conceal such evil. The nightmare was over, but its lessons would endure. Trust carefully, watch closely, and remember that evil can wear any face. Even the face of the sweet old lady next door who just wants to bring you a piece of her famous pie. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The West Memphis 3, When Darkness Devours Innocence. In the suffocating heat of a May afternoon in 1993, 3 8-year-old boys vanished into the twisted labyrinth of Arkansas woods. their laughter silenced forever by an evil so profound it would shatter a community's faith in justice itself. What emerged from those murky waters the next day would unleash a nightmare that consumed not just the victims' families, but three teenagers whose gothic appearance and outsider status made them perfect scapegoats for a town desperate for answers. This is the chilling chronicle of the West Memphis Three, a case where truth became buried beneath layers of hysteria, false confessions, and a justice system that failed catastrophically. Prepare yourself for a descent into one of America's most controversial criminal cases, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurred into a terrifying gray, and where the real monsters may have walked free while innocence rotted behind bars. The sun blazed mercilessly over West Memphis, Arkansas, on May 5, 1993, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers across the suburban landscape. In this working-class community, where trailer parks nestled against modest homes and the Mississippi River whispered its ancient secrets, three young boys were about to step into a nightmare from which they would never return. Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Steve Branch, three inseparable companions bound by the innocent adventures of childhood, had no way of knowing that this ordinary Wednesday would mark their final journey into the world of the living. At 8 years old, they possessed that fearless curiosity that drives children to explore every corner of their universe, oblivious to the predators that lurk in the shadows, waiting to snuff out the light of innocence. The morning had unfolded with deceptive normalcy. Christopher, a spirited boy with an infectious laugh that could brighten even the darkest room, kissed his stepfather goodbye and bounded out the door with the boundless energy that only children possess. His blonde hair caught the sunlight as he raced to meet his friends, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. He had no idea that evil eyes were already watching, calculating, preparing for an act so heinous it would scar a community forever. Michael Moore, quiet and thoughtful beyond his years, had spent the morning helping his mother with household chores. His gentle nature masked an inner strength that made him a natural protector of his younger friends. As he stepped out into the afternoon heat, his mother's final words of caution echoed in the air. Be home by dark, stay together, don't talk to strangers. These warnings, spoken countless times by countless parents, would prove tragically inadequate against the monster that awaited. Steve Branch, the youngest of the trio, radiated the kind of pure joy that makes childhood magical. His gap-toothed grin and mischievous eyes had charmed everyone who knew him. As he grabbed his bicycle and prepared to meet his friends, his mother felt an inexplicable chill, a mother's intuition that something terrible was stirring in the darkness. She would later describe it as feeling like death itself had brushed against her soul. The three boys converged at their usual meeting spot, their voices carrying across the warm air as they planned their afternoon adventure. Robin Hood Hills, a wooded area near their neighborhood, beckoned with its promise of hidden treasures and secret hideouts. The dense canopy of trees created a natural playground where imagination could run wild, where stick swords could slay imaginary dragons, and where young knights could defend their realm against invisible foes. But Robin Hood Hills harbored secrets far more sinister than any childhood fantasy. The woods had witnessed unspeakable acts before. Drug deals conducted in whispered conversations, lovers' meetings that turned violent, and now, something far worse was about to unfold beneath its green cathedral of leaves. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, the boys pedaled their bicycles toward their fate, their laughter growing fainter as they disappeared into the tree line. The last confirmed sighting placed them near the entrance to the wooded area around 6:30 p.m., their silhouettes vanishing into the gathering dusk like ghosts fading into the afterlife. What happened next in those dark woods would haunt investigators for decades to come. The perpetrator, driven by impulses too twisted for normal minds to comprehend, had been lying in wait like a spider in its web. The attack, when it came, was swift and merciless. The killer's method revealed a mind consumed by sadistic pleasure. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but a calculated act of pure evil. The children's screams, if they had time to scream at all, were swallowed by the indifferent woods. Their terror was witnessed only by the silent trees and the creatures that scurried away from the horror unfolding in their midst. The killer worked methodically, savoring every moment of the children's fear, feeding off their helplessness like some demonic parasite. As darkness fell across West Memphis, 3 families began their descent into hell. Pam Hobbs paced her living room, glancing repeatedly at the clock as Steve's absence stretched beyond his usual return time. Diana Moore felt her heart constrict with growing panic as Michael failed to appear for dinner. And Melissa Byers, Christopher's mother, began making frantic phone calls to neighbors and friends, her voice cracking with mounting hysteria. The initial search efforts were hampered by the darkness and the labyrinthine nature of the woods. Flashlight beams cut through the black night like desperate prayers, illuminating nothing but empty paths and silent trees. Search parties formed spontaneously as word spread through the community. Neighbors, friends, and strangers united by the universal fear that strikes when children vanish without a trace. Detective Bryn Ridge of the West Memphis Police Department arrived at the scene as the search intensified. A seasoned investigator with years of experience, Ridge had seen his share of missing children cases. Most ended with tearful reunions and sheepish explanations about losing track of time. But something about this case felt different. The woods seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the very trees were complicit in some unspeakable act. As the search continued through the night, the families clung to hope with the desperation of the drowning. Perhaps the boys had simply gotten lost. Perhaps they had fallen asleep in some hidden clearing and would emerge at dawn, hungry and embarrassed but unharmed. These fragile hopes were all that stood between them and the crushing weight of unthinkable possibilities. The killer, meanwhile, had long since vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of evil and 3 small bodies that would not be discovered until the following day. The perpetrator had chosen this location carefully. The murky waters of a drainage ditch provided the perfect hiding place for evidence, while the dense woods offered multiple escape routes and the comforting embrace of shadows. The community of West Memphis held its collective breath as dawn approached, unaware that their world was about to be forever altered by a discovery so horrific it would challenge their faith in humanity itself. The real nightmare was only beginning, and before it ended, it would consume not just the victims and their families, but 3 teenagers whose only crime was being different in a town that feared what it didn't understand. The stage was set for one of the most controversial criminal cases in American history, a case where justice would be perverted, innocence would be sacrificed on the altar of public hysteria, and the truth would remain buried beneath layers of prejudice, fear, and incompetence. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the Arkansas landscape, searchers prepared to resume their desperate quest. They had no idea that within hours, they would make a discovery so traumatic that it would scar everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The West Memphis 3 case was about to explode into the public consciousness, igniting a firestorm of controversy that continues to rage to this day. The morning mist rose from the woods like the souls of the departed, and in that ethereal fog, 3 young lives had already been extinguished by a monster who walked among them undetected. The hunt for the killer was about to begin, but in their desperation for answers, authorities would pursue the wrong prey, allowing the real predator to escape into the shadows where evil thrives. The morning of May 6, 1993, dawned gray and oppressive, as if nature itself recoiled from the horror that was about to be unveiled. The search for the 3 missing boys resumed with renewed intensity, fueled by a community's growing desperation and the sinking realization that time was running out. What they would discover in the murky waters of that secluded drainage ditch would shatter every assumption about safety, innocence, and the capacity for human evil. Steve Jones, a juvenile officer with the West Memphis Police Department, led one of the search teams deeper into Robin Hood Hills as the morning sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above. The woods seemed different somehow, more sinister, as if the very atmosphere had been poisoned by the events of the previous day. Every shadow could conceal a clue, every sound might be the cry of a lost child, and every step forward brought them closer to a truth that would haunt them forever. The killer's methodology became clear only after the bodies were discovered, revealing a mind so twisted and depraved that it challenged the very notion of human decency. This was not a random act of violence, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of sadism that spoke to years of dark fantasies, finally given horrific life. The perpetrator had chosen the location with meticulous care, isolated enough to conduct the grisly work undisturbed, yet accessible enough to transport the victims without detection. At approximately 1:45 p.m., Officer Jones spotted something that made his blood run cold. Floating face down in the stagnant water of the drainage ditch, partially submerged and tangled in the submerged branches, was the small, pale form of a child's body. The sight struck him like a physical blow, and for a moment, the seasoned officer struggled to maintain his composure as the full weight of discovery crashed down upon him. The victim, later identified as Michael Moore, had been subjected to horrors that defied comprehension. The killer's signature was written across the small body in a language of violence so brutal that even hardened investigators would struggle to process what they witnessed. The child had been stripped of his clothing, his dignity stolen along with his life, and positioned in a manner that suggested the perpetrator derived perverse satisfaction from the degradation of his victims. As more searchers converged on the grisly scene, 2 additional bodies were discovered nearby, creating a tableau of horror that would be forever seared into the memories of all who witnessed it. Christopher Byers and Steve Branch had suffered similar fates, their small forms bearing testament to the prolonged torture they had endured before death finally granted them release from their agony. The killer's modus operandi revealed a methodical approach to torture that spoke to either extensive fantasy rehearsal or previous experience with such atrocities. Each victim had been bound with their own shoelaces, the ligatures applied with such precision that they suggested either medical knowledge or extensive practice in restraint techniques. The bindings were not merely functional. They were part of the ritual, part of the killer's need to exert absolute control over his helpless victims. Detective Bryn Ridge arrived at the scene within minutes of the discovery, his years of experience doing little to prepare him for the horror that awaited. The crime scene was a masterclass in sadistic violence, each detail more disturbing than the last. The killer had taken time with his victims, savoring their fear and pain like a connoisseur sampling fine wine. This was not a crime of passion or desperation. This was evil in its purest form. The most shocking discovery came when the bodies were carefully extracted from the water and examined more closely. Christopher Byers had been subjected to a level of mutilation so severe that seasoned investigators wept openly at the scene. The killer had performed acts of genital mutilation with surgical precision, suggesting either medical training or extensive anatomical knowledge gained through previous victims. The wound patterns indicated the use of a sharp instrument, wielded by steady hands that showed no tremor of hesitation or remorse. The positioning of the bodies revealed the killer's psychological profile with startling clarity. This was someone who derived sexual gratification from the suffering of children, someone who had likely been fantasizing about such acts for years before finally crossing the line into action. The crime scene was not just a murder site. It was a shrine to the perpetrator's twisted desires, a place where innocence had been sacrificed on the altar of unimaginable depravity. Dr. Frank Peretti, the state medical examiner who would later conduct the autopsies, described the scene as one of the most disturbing he had encountered in his career. The killer had demonstrated a level of cruelty that suggested deep psychological pathology, possibly stemming from severe childhood trauma or organic brain damage. The methodical nature of the torture indicated someone with the patience and self-control to prolong the victim's agony for his own gratification. The discovery sent shockwaves through the West Memphis community, transforming a missing children case into a hunt for one of the most depraved killers in Arkansas history. Parents clutched their children closer, doors that had never known locks were secured, and the very woods where generations of children had played were transformed into a symbol of ultimate evil. The killer's escape route became a crucial focus of the investigation. The perpetrator had demonstrated remarkable composure in the aftermath of the murders, carefully concealing the bodies and eliminating evidence before vanishing into the night. This level of post-crime organization suggested either extensive criminal experience or a personality type capable of compartmentalizing extreme violence with everyday social functioning. The brutality of the murders sparked immediate speculation about satanic ritual abuse, a theory that would later dominate the investigation and lead to one of the most controversial prosecutions in American legal history. The positioning of the bodies, the nature of the mutilations, and the symbolic significance of the location all seemed to point toward occult involvement. However, This tunnel vision would later prove to be one of the investigation's most critical failures. The real killer, watching the investigation unfold from the safety of anonymity, must have felt a perverse satisfaction at seeing the focus shift away from legitimate suspects toward the realm of satanic panic. The perpetrator understood the community's fears and prejudices, and possibly even manipulated them to ensure that suspicion would fall on easy targets rather than the true monster who walked among them undetected. The crime scene processing revealed additional horrors as investigators documented every piece of evidence with meticulous care. Fiber evidence suggested that the killer had spent considerable time at the scene, possibly revisiting the bodies to further indulge in his twisted fantasies. The lack of defensive wounds on the victims indicated either surprise attacks or the use of drugs to incapacitate the children before the torture began. The killer's knowledge of the area was evident in the choice of location and the efficient disposal of evidence. This was someone familiar with the woods, someone who knew the patrol patterns of local police, and someone who understood how to minimize the risk of discovery. The perpetrator had likely scouted the location in advance, possibly even practicing the crime in his mind before finally acting on his murderous impulses. The community's reaction to the discovery was swift and visceral. Vigils were organized, reward funds established, and demands for justice grew louder with each passing hour. The killer had not just murdered 3 children. He had murdered the community's sense of safety and innocence. The very foundations of trust that held the social fabric together had been shredded by this act of ultimate evil. As news of the horrific discovery spread beyond West Memphis, the case began to attract national attention. The brutal nature of the murders, combined with the victims' young ages, created a perfect storm of media coverage that would ultimately contribute to the rush to judgment that followed. The killer had succeeded in creating not just 3 victims, but an entire community consumed by fear and desperate for someone to blame. The investigation that followed would be marked by tunnel vision, contaminated evidence, and a prosecution more interested in securing convictions than uncovering truth. The real perpetrator of these horrific crimes would remain free while 3 teenagers paid the price for being different in a community that confused nonconformity with evil. The discovery of those 3 small bodies in the murky waters of Robin Hood Hills was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume countless lives in its wake. The West Memphis Police Department had never encountered a crime of such savage brutality, and their desperation for answers would lead them down a path that corrupted the very essence of justice itself. As the community reeled from the horrific discovery of 3 mutilated children, investigators found themselves under crushing pressure to identify and arrest the monster responsible. What they discovered instead was how easily fear could transform innocent teenagers into convenient scapegoats for unspeakable evil. The investigation took a sinister turn when Detective Bryn Ridge began focusing on what he perceived as the occult nature of the crimes. The brutal mutilations, the symbolic positioning of the bodies, and the full moon that had illuminated the night of the murders all seemed to point toward satanic ritual abuse. This theory, while compelling to a community desperate for explanations, would prove to be both unfounded and catastrophically destructive. Into this cauldron of hysteria stepped 3 teenagers whose only crime was existing on the margins of small-town society. Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr., forever to be known as the West Memphis 3, became the perfect targets for a community's need to assign blame to someone, anyone, for the unthinkable horror that had been visited upon their children. Damian Eccles, 18 years old and possessed of the brooding intensity that marks many intelligent outcasts, had long been a source of suspicion in West Memphis. His black clothing, his interest in Wicca and the occult, and his intellectual superiority complex made him an easy target for those who confused difference with deviance. He read Stephen King novels, listened to heavy metal music, and dared to think differently than his peers. Transgressions that in the fevered atmosphere following the murders would be transformed into evidence of murderous intent. The real killer, watching from the shadows as suspicion coalesced around these unlikely suspects, must have marveled at his good fortune. The investigation was moving away from legitimate leads and toward a theory so divorced from reality that it virtually guaranteed his continued freedom. While police chased phantoms of satanic cults and teenage devil worshippers, the true monster remained hidden in plain sight, probably laughing at the incompetence of those sworn to bring him to justice. Jason Baldwin, 16 and Damian's loyal friend, found himself swept up in the dragnet simply by association. A quiet, introspective teenager with no history of violence, Jason's main transgression was being friends with someone the community had already decided was guilty. His long hair and alternative music preferences were suddenly transformed into sinister indicators of criminal potential by investigators who saw what they wanted to see. The killer's actual psychological profile bore no resemblance to these teenage misfits. The perpetrator of such calculated brutality would have been someone with extensive antisocial tendencies, possibly a history of animal cruelty, and most likely previous experience with violence against children. The methodical nature of the torture suggested someone much older and more experienced than teenagers experimenting with occult imagery. Jesse Miskelly Jr., 17 and borderline intellectually disabled with an IQ of only 72, became the weak link that prosecutors would exploit to build their house of cards. His limited cognitive abilities made him particularly vulnerable to aggressive interrogation techniques, and his desperate desire to please authority figures would prove to be his downfall. The real killer had chosen his victims well, not just the 3 boys who died, but the 3 teenagers who would take the blame. The interrogation of Jesse Miskelly became a masterclass in how to extract a false confession from a vulnerable suspect. Detectives Bryn Ridge and Bill Durham subjected the mentally handicapped teenager to hours of aggressive questioning, using techniques that would be considered torture by modern standards. They fed him details about the crime, corrected his errors when his story didn't match the evidence, and gradually coerced him into confessing to murders he had never committed. The confession, when it finally came, was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions that should have been immediately apparent to any competent investigator. Miskelly's timeline was wrong. His description of the murders didn't match the physical evidence, and he changed crucial details multiple times during the interrogation. But in the fevered atmosphere of the investigation, these red flags were ignored in favor of the expedient solution the confession provided. The real perpetrator's modus operandi suggested someone with extensive knowledge of forensic countermeasures. The careful positioning of the bodies in water to wash away physical evidence, the removal of the victim's clothing to eliminate fiber transfer, and the use of ligatures made from the victim's own shoelaces all pointed to someone with either law enforcement training or extensive study of criminal investigation techniques. The prosecution's theory of the case relied heavily on the notion that the murders were part of a satanic ritual, despite the complete lack of physical evidence supporting this claim. No candles were found at the scene, no ritual implements were recovered, and no credible witnesses could place any of the defendants in the woods that night. The entire case rested on Miskelly's coerced confession and the prejudices of a community that wanted to believe that evil came from the outside rather than from within. Dr. Dale Griffiths, the prosecution's expert on cult-related crimes, testified about the supposed satanic elements of the murders with an authority that masked his complete lack of relevant qualifications. His testimony about the significance of the full moon, the date of the murders, and the nature of the mutilations painted a picture of ritualistic killing that had no basis in fact but perfectly matched the community's preconceived notions about the defendants. The defense faced an uphill battle against not just the prosecution but the collective hysteria of an entire community. Defense attorneys struggled to present alternative theories of the case while being repeatedly hamstrung by judicial rulings that prevented them from exploring other suspects or challenging the fundamental assumptions underlying the prosecution's case. The real killer's ability to remain undetected spoke to either extraordinary luck or calculated intelligence. The perpetrator had successfully deflected suspicion onto convenient scapegoats while leaving virtually no physical evidence linking himself to the crimes. The investigation's focus on satanic ritual abuse provided perfect cover for someone whose actual motivations were far more mundane but infinitely more dangerous. As the trial proceeded, it became increasingly clear that the defendants were being prosecuted not for what they had done, but for who they were. Their appearance, their interests, and their refusal to conform to small-town expectations became the primary evidence against them. The prosecution skillfully played on the jury's fears and prejudices, transforming teenage nonconformity into proof of murderous intent. The community's need for closure overrode any concern for actual justice. The families of the victims, desperate for someone to blame for their unimaginable loss, embraced the prosecution's theory despite its obvious flaws. The real killer had not only escaped punishment but had successfully manipulated an entire community into destroying 3 innocent lives to protect his own freedom. The media coverage of the case focused heavily on the supposed satanic elements, further cementing public opinion against the defendants. Images of Damien Eccles in his black clothing, combined with sensationalized reporting about his interest in the occult, created a narrative that was impossible to overcome through rational argument or presentation of evidence. The killer's success in avoiding detection while 3 innocent teenagers faced execution for his crimes represented one of the most profound failures of the American justice system. The real monster walked free while the community celebrated what they believed was justice served. The West Memphis 3 case had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to override evidence and reason in the pursuit of justice. The conviction of Damien Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. should have brought closure to the devastated community of West Memphis. Instead, it marked the beginning of an even more insidious horror, the realization that in their desperate hunger for justice, they had devoured the innocent while allowing the true monster to escape into the darkness. The real killer's greatest triumph was not just evading capture, but watching as the system designed to catch him destroyed 3 young lives in his place. The sentencing phase revealed the true depths of the community's bloodlust. Damien Eccles, barely 18 years old, was sentenced to death by lethal injection, a punishment that would see him spend nearly 2 decades on death row for crimes he never committed. The irony was as bitter as it was profound. In their quest to punish evil, they had become the very thing they sought to destroy. The real perpetrator, watching from the shadows, must have savored every moment of their perverted triumph. Jason Baldwin and Jesse Miskelly Jr. received life sentences without the possibility of parole, their youth and potential sacrificed on the altar of a community's need for vengeance. The killer had achieved the perfect crime. Not only had he escaped punishment for his monstrous acts, but he had successfully orchestrated the destruction of 3 more lives. His victims now numbered not 3, but 6. The years that followed the conviction revealed a disturbing pattern of overlooked evidence and ignored leads that pointed to the real perpetrator. John Mark Byers, Christopher Byers' stepfather, emerged as a figure whose violent history and erratic behavior should have made him a prime suspect from the beginning. His criminal record included domestic violence, drug dealing, and threats of violence that painted a picture of someone capable of the brutal murders that had shattered West Memphis. Byers' behavior in the aftermath of the murders was particularly suspicious. His dramatic public displays of grief, his attempts to insert himself into the investigation, and his violent threats against the West Memphis 3 all suggested someone desperately trying to deflect suspicion from himself. The real killer often injects himself into the investigation, feeding off the attention and secretly mocking the incompetence of those sworn to catch him. The forensic evidence that could have exonerated the West Memphis 3 and pointed to the real killer was systematically ignored or misinterpreted by investigators more interested in confirming their predetermined conclusions than uncovering the truth. DNA evidence that excluded all 3 defendants from the crime scene was dismissed as irrelevant. Hair fibers that matched neither the victims nor the defendants were explained away as contamination. The real killer's biological signature was literally lying in evidence lockers while innocent men rotted in prison. The bite marks found on one of the victims told a particularly chilling story of investigative incompetence. Rather than comparing the marks to known suspects like Byers, authorities focused exclusively on trying to match them to the defendants. When the analysis failed to support their case, they simply abandoned that line of evidence rather than follow it where it led. The killer's dental impressions remained unexamined, while death sentences were carried out based on prejudice rather than proof. Terry Hobbs, Steve Branch's stepfather, emerged as another figure whose suspicious behavior and violent history warranted serious investigation. His shifting alibis, his history of domestic violence, and his strange behavior on the night of the murders should have made him a prime suspect. Instead, authorities focused their tunnel vision on teenagers whose only crime was being different. The real killer hid in plain sight while innocent lives were destroyed by institutional prejudice. The West Memphis Police Department's handling of the case revealed a level of incompetence so profound it bordered on criminal negligence. Evidence was contaminated, witnesses were coached, and alternative theories were dismissed without investigation. The killer had chosen his hunting ground well. a jurisdiction where investigative incompetence would provide perfect cover for his escape. The confession that sealed the defendant's fate was later revealed to be a masterpiece of coercive interrogation. Jesse Miskelly's limited intellectual capacity made him the perfect target for psychological manipulation, and detectives exploited his disability with ruthless efficiency. The real killer could not have asked for a more perfect patsy. Someone whose desperate need to please authority figures would lead him to confess to murders he never committed. The decades-long fight for the defendant's freedom revealed the corruption at the heart of the case. New evidence emerged that further undermined the prosecution's theory, including DNA analysis that excluded all three men from the crime scene while pointing to potential alternative suspects. The real killer's genetic signature was literally embedded in the evidence, yet authorities continued to resist acknowledging their catastrophic error. The Alford plea that finally freed the West Memphis Three in 2011 represented a Pyrrhic victory that exposed the system's inability to admit its mistakes. The men were released after nearly 2 decades of wrongful imprisonment, but the state's refusal to declare them innocent meant the real killer remained protected by the fiction of their guilt. Justice had not been served, it had been perverted beyond recognition. The documentary series that brought national attention to the case revealed the true horror of what had transpired in West Memphis. Paradise Lost. The child murders at Robin Hood Hills exposed the flimsy evidence, coercive interrogation techniques, and blatant prejudice that had convicted 3 innocent teenagers. The real killer's greatest fear, exposure of the truth, finally began to materialize as public opinion shifted in favor of the defendants. The investigation that should have focused on the actual perpetrator instead became a witch hunt that destroyed multiple families while leaving the community vulnerable to continued predation. The killer walked free among them for nearly 2 decades, secure in the knowledge that the system's incompetence had provided perfect protection. How many other victims might there have been during those lost years? How many other families suffered because justice had been perverted into vengeance? The technological advances in DNA analysis that eventually helped free the West Memphis Three also revealed the shocking inadequacy of the original investigation. Modern forensic techniques could have identified the real killer within days of the murders if they had been properly employed. Instead, the rush to judgment and tunnel vision thinking allowed a monster to escape while destroying innocent lives. The civil rights violations inherent in the case were staggering in their scope and brutality. The defendants were denied adequate counsel, subjected to prosecutorial misconduct, and convicted based on prejudice rather than evidence. The real killer had not only escaped punishment but had successfully manipulated the system into destroying his would-be accusers. The true cost of the West Memphis Three case extends far beyond the 3 men who were wrongfully convicted. The victims' families were denied real justice, the community's faith in their institutions was shattered, and a killer remained free to potentially claim more victims. The system designed to protect the innocent had become the instrument of their destruction. The case stands as a monument to the dangers of allowing fear and prejudice to override evidence and reason in the pursuit of justice. The real killer achieved the perfect crime not through cunning or luck, but by exploiting the worst impulses of a community desperate for someone to blame. 3 children died brutal deaths, and 3 teenagers paid the price for a killer's freedom. Today, as Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly Jr. attempt to rebuild their shattered lives, the real killer remains unnamed and unpunished. The monster who tortured and murdered 3 innocent children has never faced justice for his crimes. The West Memphis Three case serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest evil lies not in the shadows where monsters hide, but in the courtrooms where justice is supposed to prevail. The woods of Robin Hood Hills still whisper their secrets to those who listen, but the truth they contain remains buried beneath layers of incompetence, corruption, and willful blindness. 3 children's cries for justice echo unanswered through time, while their real killer walks free, the ultimate beneficiary of a system that confused vengeance with justice and prejudice with proof. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our 4th story. Story 4. When a mother's love turns to lethal betrayal, the Susan Smith case. On a moonless October night in 1994, the unthinkable happened in the quiet town of Union, South Carolina. A mother's sacred bond with her children was severed not by tragedy, but by her own murderous hands. Susan Smith, a 23-year-old mother with the face of an angel and the heart of a demon, would orchestrate one of the most heinous acts of filicide in American history, drowning her own babies in the dark waters of John D. Long Lake while they screamed for the mother who was killing them. For 9 excruciating days, she would weave a web of lies so elaborate, so convincing, that an entire nation would search for phantom kidnappers while the real monster stood before television cameras, crocodile tears streaming down her face as she begged for the safe return of children she had already murdered with her own hands. This is the chilling chronicle of maternal evil in its purest form, a descent into a darkness so profound that it redefined our understanding of the lengths to which a human being will go to escape responsibility, even if it means sacrificing the most innocent lives imaginable. Prepare yourself for a journey into the twisted mind of a killer who wore the mask of motherhood while harboring the soul of a predator. The autumn air in Union, South Carolina, carried with it the scent of dying leaves and approaching winter on the evening of October 25th, 1994. For most families, this was a time of cozy preparations for the holidays ahead, of children's laughter echoing through homes filled with warmth and love. But in the twisted mind of Susan Smith, this crisp October night would become the stage for an act of maternal betrayal so profound that it would shatter every assumption about the protective instincts that are supposed to define motherhood itself. Susan Lee Vaughn Smith had spent 23 years perfecting the art of deception, crafting a persona that masked the seething cauldron of narcissism, manipulation, and murderous rage that bubbled beneath her carefully constructed exterior. To the outside world, she appeared to be the epitome of young Southern motherhood, blonde, petite, and possessed of that particular brand of fragile beauty that evokes protective instincts in others. But behind her doe-like eyes lurked a calculating intelligence that viewed her own children not as precious gifts to be cherished, but as inconvenient obstacles to be eliminated when they threatened her selfish desires. The day of the murders began like any other, with 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander Smith waking up in their modest home on Tony Road, unaware that their mother had already decided this would be their last day on Earth. Michael, a bright and curious toddler with his father's dark hair and trusting eyes, had no way of knowing that the woman who had given him life was now planning to take it away. Alexander, barely more than a baby, still relied completely on his mother for survival, a trust that would be repaid with the ultimate betrayal. Susan's methodology in planning the murders revealed a level of premeditation that chilled investigators to their core. This was not a crime of passion, not a moment of temporary insanity, but a calculated execution planned with the cold precision of a seasoned killer. She had chosen John D. Long Lake as the watery grave for her children weeks in advance, driving the route repeatedly to ensure she could navigate it in the dark. The killer had scouted her disposal site like a military strategist planning a campaign, measuring distances, timing the drive, and calculating the exact angle needed to send her car rolling into the murky depths. The psychological profile of a filicidal mother typically includes severe personality disorders, often combined with a complete lack of empathy for others, including her own children. Susan Smith embodied these characteristics perfectly, viewing Michael and Alexander not as human beings with their own right to exist, but as extensions of herself that could be discarded when they became inconvenient. Her children were props in the drama of her life, and when the script called for their elimination, she felt no more remorse than an actress discarding a costume. The final day of the boys' lives unfolded with agonizing normalcy, each precious moment ticking away toward the horror that awaited them as darkness fell. Michael played with his toys, his innocent laughter filling the house as he remained blissfully unaware that death was stalking him in the form of the woman he trusted most. Alexander, still so young that his world consisted entirely of basic needs and the comfort of familiar faces, gurgled and smiled at his mother, having no concept that she was already planning his murder. Susan's behavior throughout that final day was remarkable for its calculated normalcy. She went through the motions of caring for her children, feeding them, changing Alexander's diaper, reading to Michael, all while knowing that within hours, she would be strapping them into their car seats and driving them to their deaths. The killer's ability to compartmentalize her murderous intentions while maintaining the facade of loving motherhood spoke to a level of psychological pathology that defied comprehension. As evening approached, Susan began the final preparations for her crime. She loaded the boys into their car seats in her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protégé, a vehicle that would soon become their tomb beneath the dark waters of the lake. Michael, secure in his booster seat, may have been excited about the unexpected nighttime car ride, chattering away to his mother as she drove toward his doom. Alexander, strapped into his infant carrier, would have been soothed by the motion of the car, perhaps drifting off to sleep as death approached on silent wheels. The drive to John D. Long Lake took approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes during which Susan Smith had multiple opportunities to reconsider her monstrous plan, to turn around and drive home to safety. Instead, she used this time to steel herself for the act of murder, probably rehearsing in her mind the sequence of events that would send her children to a watery grave. The killer's resolve never wavered, her determination to eliminate her offspring stronger than any vestige of maternal instinct. The methodology she had chosen for the murders was particularly cruel, as it ensured that her children would experience maximum terror before death finally claimed them. Drowning is one of the most agonizing ways to die, involving minutes of struggle, panic, and desperate gasping for air that would never come. Susan Smith knew this when she chose this method. She wanted her children to suffer, wanted them to experience the full horror of their abandonment before they died. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Susan arrived at the boat ramp on John D. Long Lake, the headlights of her Mazda cutting through the darkness as she prepared to commit the unthinkable. The killer's hands were steady as she put the car in neutral and released the emergency brake. Her heart rate probably elevated not from remorse or second thoughts, but from the adrenaline rush that accompanied the commission of her perfect crime. The car began its inexorable roll toward the water's edge, gaining momentum as gravity pulled it toward the lake. Inside the vehicle, Michael and Alexander may have sensed that something was wrong, but they were helpless to escape from their car seats as their mother's betrayal played out with mechanical precision. The killer stood on the shore, watching as her children's tomb disappeared beneath the surface, their screams swallowed by the indifferent waters. The psychological aftermath of the murders revealed the true depths of Susan Smith's depravity. Rather than being consumed by guilt or horror at what she had done, she immediately began crafting the elaborate deception that would make her the center of a massive search effort. The killer's primary concern was not the lives she had just taken, but how to spin their deaths to her maximum advantage. Within minutes of drowning her children, Susan was already perfecting the lie that would captivate a nation. She would claim that a black man had carjacked her vehicle at a traffic light, driving off with her precious babies still strapped in their seats. This fabrication was carefully calculated to exploit racial tensions and stereotypes, ensuring maximum media coverage and public sympathy for her supposed plight. The drive back to town gave Susan time to compose herself and begin the performance of a lifetime. She would need to convince police, media, and the public that she was a distraught mother whose children had been stolen by a stranger. The killer understood that her survival depended on her ability to project grief and desperation while hiding the satisfaction she felt at having eliminated the obstacles to her freedom. The site she chose for her supposed carjacking was equally calculated, a remote intersection where there would be no witnesses to contradict her story. Susan Smith had thought of everything, or so she believed. The killer's arrogance would ultimately prove to be her downfall, as she underestimated the ability of investigators to see through her carefully constructed lies. As she prepared to contact authorities and report her children missing, Susan Smith was about to embark on a 9-day charade that would mobilize law enforcement agencies across multiple states, generate international media coverage, and capture the sympathy of millions of people who had no idea they were being manipulated by a child killer. The real horror was just beginning, as the woman who had murdered her own children prepared to become the star of her own twisted drama. The water of John D. Long Lake closed over the Mazda Protégé with barely a ripple, erasing the last traces of Michael and Alexander Smith from the world above. But beneath the surface, in the cold darkness of their watery tomb, the evidence of their mother's ultimate betrayal would wait patiently to be discovered. ready to expose the truth about the woman who had traded their lives for her own selfish freedom. The performance began at 9:12 p.m. on October 25, 1994, when Susan Smith placed a frantic 911 call that would launch one of the most massive search efforts in South Carolina history. Her voice, trembling with what appeared to be genuine terror and desperation, painted a picture of a mother whose world had been shattered by a random act of violence. But every word that spilled from her lips was a calculated lie, each sob a masterful manipulation designed to deflect attention from the unspeakable truth that she was not a victim, but the perpetrator of the most heinous crime imaginable. "My children are gone. He took my children," she screamed into the phone, her voice cracking with what listeners interpreted as unbearable anguish. The 911 dispatcher, trained to handle emergency situations, found herself dealing with what appeared to be every parent's worst nightmare: a mother whose babies had been stolen by a stranger. The killer's performance was so convincing that experienced emergency personnel never questioned the authenticity of her distress, never suspected that they were being manipulated by a woman who had just committed double murder. Susan's fabricated account of the carjacking was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, carefully crafted to exploit every prejudice and fear that existed in the American psyche. She described her attacker as a black man in his 30s, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a knit cap and driving an older model car. This description was not chosen randomly. It was designed to tap into the darkest stereotypes and ensure that law enforcement would focus their investigation on finding a phantom perpetrator rather than examining the person who was standing right in front of them. The location she chose for her supposed victimization was equally strategic. The intersection of Monarch Mills Road and Highway 49 was remote enough that there would be no witnesses to contradict her story, yet believable as a site where a criminal might lie in wait for potential victims. Susan had driven this route numerous times while planning her children's murders, and she knew every detail of the terrain, knowledge that would prove invaluable in making her lie seem authentic. Sheriff Howard Wells of Union County arrived at the scene within minutes of the 911 call, finding what appeared to be a young mother in the throes of unimaginable trauma. Susan Smith's performance for the sheriff was even more compelling than her initial phone call, as she threw herself into the role of desperate victim with Academy Award-worthy intensity. Her body language, her vocal patterns, even the way she clutched at herself as if trying to hold together a shattered soul. Every aspect of her behavior was carefully calculated to generate sympathy and deflect suspicion. The killer's methodology in constructing her alibi revealed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and police procedure. She knew that investigators would need a timeline, so she provided one that placed her at various locations throughout the evening, creating a trail of supposed evidence that would support her fabricated story. She claimed to have been driving around, upset about problems with her estranged husband, when the carjacking occurred, a detail that provided emotional context for her being out alone with the children at night. The initial police response to Susan's report was swift and comprehensive, reflecting the urgency that missing children cases always generate in law enforcement communities. Roadblocks were established throughout Union County and beyond. Every black male who even remotely matched the suspect description was stopped and questioned, and hundreds of officers were mobilized to search for the burgundy Mazda that supposedly contained 2 kidnapped children. The media descended on Union like a plague of locusts, drawn by the compelling narrative of an innocent mother whose children had been stolen by a predator. Susan Smith became the face of maternal suffering, her tearful pleas for her children's safe return broadcast across television screens throughout America and beyond. The killer's ability to generate sympathy was unprecedented. She received thousands of letters of support, offers of reward money, and prayers from people who had no idea they were being manipulated by the very monster they sought to comfort. The search effort that followed Susan's false report was staggering in its scope and intensity. FBI agents joined local law enforcement in canvassing the area, interviewing witnesses, and following up on hundreds of tips that poured in from across the country. Volunteers organized search parties that combed through woods, fields, and abandoned buildings, looking for any sign of the missing children or their alleged abductor. Every hour that passed increased the urgency, as investigators knew that the chances of finding kidnapped children alive decreased dramatically with time. Susan's behavior during the search was a study in calculated performance art. She appeared at press conferences with red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, making passionate pleas for her children's safe return that moved hardened reporters to tears. Her supposed ex-husband David stood beside her at many of these appearances, his genuine grief providing the perfect counterpoint to her fabricated anguish. The killer fed off the attention like a vampire feeds off blood, secretly reveling in her ability to manipulate an entire nation. The psychological profile that emerged during the search painted Susan as the perfect victim, a young, attractive mother from a troubled background who was doing her best to raise her children despite difficult circumstances. Her history of depression and suicide attempts generated additional sympathy, as the public saw her as someone who had already endured more than her share of suffering. The killer's past became her shield, protecting her from suspicion while she basked in undeserved compassion. The investigation's focus on finding the alleged carjacker consumed enormous resources and led law enforcement down countless dead ends. Composite sketches based on Susan's description were distributed nationwide, generating hundreds of false leads and resulting in the harassment of innocent black men who had the misfortune to match the fabricated suspect description. The killer's lie had not only covered up her crimes, it had turned an entire community's fear and prejudice into weapons of mass distraction. Behind the scenes, Susan was already beginning to show cracks in her performance. Close friends and family members noticed inconsistencies in her story, subtle changes in details that should have remained constant. Her demeanor when she thought cameras weren't rolling was markedly different from her public persona. Calmer, more calculating, occasionally even bored by the proceedings she had orchestrated. The killer's sexual motivations for the murders began to emerge as investigators delved deeper into her personal life. Susan had been involved in an affair with Tom Findley, the wealthy son of her employer, who had made it clear that he was not interested in a relationship with a woman who had children. The murders were not crimes of passion or mental illness. They were calculated eliminations of perceived obstacles to Susan's romantic ambitions. The forensic timeline that investigators were assembling began to reveal troubling inconsistencies in Susan's account. Her story about driving around aimlessly before the carjacking didn't match with gas station receipts and other evidence of her actual whereabouts. The killer had been meticulous in planning the murders, but she had underestimated the ability of modern investigative techniques to reconstruct her movements with scientific precision. As the search entered its second week, the pressure on Susan to maintain her performance was beginning to show. The constant media attention, the repeated interviews with investigators, and the need to maintain her facade of grief were taking a psychological toll that even her considerable acting abilities couldn't entirely mask. Small details in her story began to shift, timing became inconsistent, and her emotional responses seemed increasingly rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The killer's greatest strength, her ability to manipulate others, was also becoming her greatest weakness. Each lie required additional lies to support it, creating an increasingly complex web of deception that demanded perfect memory and flawless performance. Susan Smith was discovering that maintaining a fabrication of this magnitude was far more difficult than committing the murders that had necessitated it. Law enforcement agencies were also beginning to notice the inconsistencies, though they were reluctant to voice their suspicions publicly. The case had generated so much media attention and public sympathy that openly questioning Susan's story would have been career suicide for any investigator. But privately, seasoned detectives were starting to wonder whether they were chasing a phantom created by the very person they were trying to help. The breakthrough that would ultimately expose Susan's lies was approaching with the inevitability of divine justice. Her children's bodies, trapped in their underwater tomb, were waiting to bear witness against the woman who had murdered them. The killer had thought herself clever in choosing water as their grave, not realizing that modern forensic techniques would eventually reveal every detail of her crimes. The nation held its breath as the search continued, millions of people praying for the safe return of two innocent children who were already dead, killed by the very woman who appeared on television pleading for their lives. Susan Smith had succeeded in creating the perfect deception, but perfection in evil, like perfection in all things, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. The unraveling of Susan Smith's elaborate deception began with the smallest of inconsistencies. tiny cracks in her carefully constructed facade that would eventually split wide enough to reveal the monstrous truth beneath. As the search for her supposedly kidnapped children entered its second week, seasoned investigators began to notice discrepancies in her story that couldn't be explained away by trauma or grief. The killer who had orchestrated such a brilliant murder was about to discover that maintaining a lie of this magnitude required skills even beyond her considerable talents for manipulation and deception. Sheriff Howard Wells, despite his initial sympathy for Susan's apparent plight, found himself troubled by nagging doubts that he couldn't quite articulate. His decades of experience in law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts, and those instincts were screaming that something fundamental was wrong with the picture Susan Smith was painting. The grieving mother's behavior during private interviews was subtly different from her public performances, less emotional, more calculating, occasionally even bored by questions she should have been desperate to answer. The technological breakthrough that would ultimately expose Susan's lies came from an unexpected source: the traffic light at the intersection where she claimed to have been carjacked. Investigators discovered that this particular traffic light operated on a timer system that had been malfunctioning for weeks, remaining red in all directions for extended periods. Susan's claim that she had stopped at a red light, providing the opportunity for her carjacking, was physically impossible given the traffic control system's documented malfunction during the time she specified. The killer's reaction to this revelation was telling in its restraint. Rather than the shock and confusion that would have been natural for a genuine victim learning that police doubted her story, Susan displayed what investigators recognized as calculated damage control. She began modifying details of her account, claiming that perhaps she had misremembered exactly where the carjacking occurred, or that maybe the timeline wasn't as precise as she had initially stated. FBI profilers who had been studying the case began to develop a different theory altogether, one that placed Susan Smith not as victim, but as perpetrator. The statistical reality that most children are killed by their own parents, combined with the inconsistencies in her story and her unusual psychological profile, led federal investigators to consider the unthinkable possibility that the grieving mother they had been trying to help was actually the killer they were seeking. The psychological pressure of maintaining her deception was beginning to take a visible toll on Susan's ability to perform her role convincingly. Friends and family members noticed increasing inconsistencies in her emotional responses. Moments of what appeared to be relief or satisfaction when she thought no one was watching, followed by sudden returns to her grieving mother persona when attention focused on her again. The killer was discovering that the human psyche isn't designed to sustain such profound deception indefinitely. The media, initially sympathetic to Susan's plight, began to pick up on the subtle signs that all was not as it appeared. Investigative reporters noted discrepancies between her public statements and her private behavior, questioning why a mother whose children had been kidnapped seemed more concerned with her appearance on camera than with providing detailed information that might help locate her sons. The killer's narcissism was beginning to show through her carefully constructed mask. The forensic timeline that investigators were painstakingly reconstructing painted an increasingly damning picture of Susan's activities on the night of October 25th. Gas station receipts, surveillance footage, and witness statements created a chain of evidence that contradicted key elements of her carjacking story. The killer had been meticulous in planning the murders but had underestimated the ability of modern investigative techniques to track her movements with scientific precision. On November 3, 1994, 9 days after she had murdered her children and launched the massive deception, Susan Smith was asked to take a polygraph examination. The request, presented as routine procedure to help eliminate her as a suspect and focus the investigation more effectively, represented the beginning of the end for her elaborate charade. The killer's physiological responses to questions about her children's disappearance would reveal what her words had tried so desperately to conceal. The polygraph examination was conducted by FBI polygrapher John Douglas, a specialist in detecting deception who had interviewed some of America's most notorious killers. Susan's responses to the carefully crafted questions revealed a pattern of deception that was unmistakable to trained observers. When asked direct questions about whether she knew where her children were or whether she had harmed them, her physiological responses screamed guilt even as her voice maintained innocence. The confrontation that followed the failed polygraph was a masterclass in investigative psychology. Rather than immediately accusing Susan of murder, investigators used her own lies against her, presenting the evidence of her deception piece by piece, and watching as her carefully constructed story collapsed under the weight of contradictions. The killer who had manipulated an entire nation was about to discover that she had finally met opponents who were immune to her considerable charms. The moment of truth came when investigators presented Susan with an ultimatum: tell the truth about what happened to her children, or face the consequences of continuing to obstruct a federal investigation. The killer's narcissistic personality, which had served her so well in manipulating others, suddenly became her greatest weakness, as she found herself unable to accept responsibility for her actions while simultaneously being unable to maintain her increasingly implausible lies. The confession, when it finally came, was as shocking in its cold calculation as the murders themselves had been. Susan Smith admitted that she had driven her children to John D. Long Lake with the specific intention of drowning them, that she had released the parking brake and watched as their car rolled into the water with her sons still strapped helplessly in their seats. The killer's description of her children's final moments was delivered with a clinical detachment that chilled even experienced investigators. The search teams that had spent 9 days looking for kidnapped children now faced the horrific task of recovering the bodies of murder victims from the bottom of a lake. Divers descended into the murky waters of John D. Long Lake, their powerful lights cutting through the darkness as they searched for the burgundy Mazda that had become a tomb for 2 innocent children. The recovery operation was conducted with the reverence and care befitting the retrieval of victims, but nothing could diminish the horror of what they found. The car was located upside down in approximately 18 feet of water, its windows still intact and its doors closed, creating an air pocket that would have prolonged the children's agony as they slowly drowned. Michael and Alexander Smith were still strapped in their car seats, their small bodies bearing witness to the terror they had experienced in their final moments. The killer's method of murder was revealed to be even more cruel than investigators had imagined. The forensic evidence recovered from the submerged vehicle painted a horrifying picture of the children's final minutes. Scratch marks on the inside of the windows indicated that 3-year-old Michael had desperately tried to escape from the sinking car, his tiny fingers clawing at glass that offered no hope of salvation. The positioning of the bodies suggested that both children had been conscious and aware as the water rose around them, calling out for a mother who had already condemned them to death. The public reaction to Susan Smith's confession was one of shock, horror, and betrayal on a scale rarely seen in American criminal history. The millions of people who had prayed for the safe return of her children, who had contributed to reward funds and joined search efforts, suddenly realized they had been manipulated by the very monster they had sought to comfort. The killer's ability to generate sympathy had been so complete that her exposure left an entire nation feeling violated and deceived. The media coverage shifted overnight from sympathetic portraits of a grieving mother to horrified examinations of a calculating killer who had used her own children's deaths to generate fame and attention. The same cameras that had broadcast her tearful pleas for her son's safe return now captured her being led away in handcuffs, her mask of innocence finally stripped away to reveal the cold-blooded killer beneath. The families who had genuinely grieved for Susan's supposedly kidnapped children now found themselves grappling with the knowledge that their sympathy had been manipulated by a woman who had committed the most unnatural crime imaginable. The killer's deception had victimized not just her own children, but everyone who had been touched by their story and moved to care about their fate. The confession marked the end of the search, but the beginning of a legal proceeding that would expose the full depths of Susan Smith's depravity. The woman who had drowned her children to pursue a selfish romantic relationship now faced the possibility of joining them in death, executed by a state that reserved its ultimate punishment for the most heinous crimes. The killer's perfect plan had collapsed entirely, leaving her facing the consequences she had tried so desperately to avoid. The trial of Susan Smith began on July 10, 1995, in a Union County courthouse transformed into the epicenter of one of the most emotionally charged legal proceedings in American history. The woman who had captivated a nation with her lies now sat in the defendant's chair, her carefully crafted persona of grieving motherhood replaced by the cold reality of what she truly was, a killer who had murdered her own children in the most calculated and cruel manner imaginable. The prosecution would seek the ultimate penalty for her crimes, while the defense would attempt to explain away the unexplainable through claims of mental illness and childhood trauma. Prosecutor Tommy Pope faced the daunting task of presenting evidence so horrific that even seasoned courtroom observers would struggle to maintain their composure. The state's case was built around the irrefutable evidence of Susan's guilt: her own confession, the forensic evidence recovered from the lake, and the mountain of lies she had told during the 9-day deception that had fooled an entire nation. The killer's methodology would be laid bare before the jury, forcing them to confront the reality of what one human being could do to the most innocent victims imaginable. The forensic evidence presented during the trial painted a picture of calculated murder that defied every natural instinct of motherhood. The positioning of the car at the bottom of John D. Long Lake revealed that Susan had chosen the steepest part of the boat ramp, ensuring that the vehicle would roll quickly into deep water where her children would have no chance of survival. The killer's attention to detail extended even to the angle of entry, calculated to minimize the possibility of the car getting stuck in shallow water where the children might have been rescued. The autopsy reports, delivered by Dr. Sandra Conradi, the forensic pathologist who had examined the children's remains, provided the jury with clinical details that nonetheless conveyed the horror of Michael and Alexander's final moments. Both children had drowned, their lungs filled with the murky water of John D. Long Lake as they struggled desperately for air that would never come. The evidence indicated that they had been alive and conscious as the car sank, experiencing the full terror of their abandonment before death finally released them from their agony. The prosecution's presentation of Susan's psychological profile revealed a killer whose motivations were as chilling as her methods. The evidence showed that she had murdered her children not in a moment of temporary insanity, but as a calculated solution to what she perceived as obstacles to her romantic ambitions. Tom Findley's letter, in which he had made it clear that he was not interested in a relationship with a woman who had children, became the prosecution's smoking gun. Proof that Susan had viewed her son's deaths as necessary sacrifices to her selfish desires. The defense team, led by David Bruck, faced an almost impossible task in trying to save Susan Smith's life. Their strategy relied heavily on portraying her as a victim of childhood sexual abuse and mental illness, arguing that her traumatic past had damaged her psychologically to the point where she was not fully responsible for her actions. The killer's history of depression and suicide attempts was presented as evidence of a mind so broken that it could not be held accountable for even the most heinous crimes. The testimony regarding Susan's childhood painted a picture of dysfunction and abuse that was undeniably tragic, but failed to explain away the calculated nature of her crimes. Her stepfather's sexual abuse, her father's suicide, and her mother's emotional neglect were all presented as factors that had contributed to her psychological deterioration. However, the prosecution effectively countered that millions of abuse survivors managed to live productive lives without murdering their own children. The killer's behavior during the trial was closely monitored by court observers and psychological experts who noted her continued attempts at manipulation even while facing the possibility of execution. Susan's courtroom demeanor was carefully calculated to generate sympathy. She dressed conservatively, maintained a subdued appearance, and occasionally displayed what appeared to be genuine remorse for her actions. However, those who observed her closely noted that her emotional responses seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The most damning testimony came from Susan herself when she took the stand in her own defense. Her account of the murders, delivered in a flat, emotionless tone, revealed the true depths of her callousness. She described watching her children drown with the clinical detachment of someone discussing the weather, occasionally breaking into tears that seemed more calculated than genuine. The killer's inability to display authentic remorse, even when her life hung in the balance, convinced many observers that she was beyond redemption. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered with passionate intensity by Tommy Pope, painted Susan Smith as the embodiment of evil in its purest form. A mother who had violated the most sacred trust imaginable by murdering the children she was supposed to protect. The prosecutor's words echoed through the courtroom as he described the terror that Michael and Alexander must have experienced in their final moments, calling out for a mother who had already decided they must die. The jury's deliberation lasted less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The speed of their decision reflected not just the overwhelming evidence of Susan's guilt, but the jurors' horror at the nature of her crimes. The killer who had manipulated an entire nation was finally facing the consequences of her actions, though even the guilty verdict seemed inadequate punishment for what she had done. The penalty phase of the trial presented the jury with the ultimate question: whether Susan Smith deserved to live or die for her crimes. The prosecution argued that the calculated nature of the murders, combined with the killer's complete lack of remorse, made her a candidate for the state's ultimate punishment. The defense continued to emphasize her traumatic background and mental illness, arguing that execution would compound the tragedy rather than serve justice. The jury's decision to spare Susan Smith's life and sentence her to life in prison without the possibility of parole was met with mixed reactions from a public that had been horrified by her crimes. Many felt that a woman who had drowned her own children deserved the same fate, while others believed that life imprisonment was a more appropriate punishment that would force her to live with her crimes for decades to come. The killer's incarceration at the Leith Correctional Institution marked the beginning of a new chapter in her story, one in which she would no longer be the center of attention but simply another inmate serving a life sentence. Prison records would later reveal that Susan continued her pattern of manipulation even behind bars, engaging in inappropriate relationships with guards and attempting to use her notoriety to gain special treatment. The impact of the Susan Smith case extended far beyond the courtroom, fundamentally changing how America viewed missing children cases and the parents who reported them. Law enforcement agencies across the country implemented new protocols for investigating kidnapping claims, recognizing that the most dangerous predators often hide behind masks of parental concern. The killer's legacy was one of shattered trust and increased suspicion that would affect genuine victims for years to come. The families of Michael and Alexander Smith continued to struggle with the aftermath of Susan's crimes long after her conviction. David Smith, the children's father, became an advocate for victims' rights while struggling to rebuild his life after losing his sons to the woman he had once loved. The killer's betrayal had victimized not just her children, but everyone who had loved them and believed in their mother's innocence. The psychological analysis of the case revealed disturbing insights into the mind of a filicidal parent, contributing to academic understanding of how seemingly normal individuals can commit the most heinous crimes against their own children. Susan Smith became a case study in criminal psychology, her actions dissected by experts seeking to understand how maternal instinct could be so completely perverted by narcissism and self-interest. The media coverage of the case established new standards for responsible reporting on missing children cases, as journalists recognized how easily they had been manipulated by Susan's performance. The killer's ability to fool experienced reporters and law enforcement professionals served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting emotional appeals at face value without thorough investigation of the facts. Today, nearly 3 decades after she murdered her children, Susan Smith remains incarcerated, her life reduced to the confines of a prison cell where she will likely spend the remainder of her days. The woman who once commanded international attention now exists in relative obscurity, a forgotten killer whose crimes continue to serve as a reminder of the depths to which human evil can descend. The waters of John D. Long Lake continue to flow, no longer holding the terrible secret of 2 innocent children's deaths, but forever marked as the place where a mother's love was replaced by murderous betrayal. Michael and Alexander Smith rest in peace, their brief lives serving as a testament to the innocence that Susan Smith destroyed when she chose her selfish desires over her children's right to live. The long-term psychological impact of Susan's crimes extended far beyond her immediate victims, creating ripples of trauma that continue to affect countless lives. Child advocacy groups reported a significant increase in public suspicion toward parents reporting missing children, as Susan's elaborate deception had shattered the assumption that maternal grief was always genuine. The killer had not only murdered her own children, she had poisoned the well of public trust that genuine victims desperately needed. Prison psychologists who evaluated Susan over the years documented her continued inability to accept full responsibility for her actions, even decades after her conviction. She persisted in portraying herself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of her children's deaths, demonstrating the pathological narcissism that had driven her to murder in the first place. The killer's self-serving narrative never wavered, even as the weight of her crimes continued to crush the lives of those who had loved her children. The evolution of forensic technology since Susan's crimes has made similar deceptions increasingly difficult to maintain. Advanced DNA analysis, sophisticated surveillance systems, and improved investigative techniques would likely have exposed her lies within hours rather than days. The killer had succeeded partly because she committed her crimes at a time when technology hadn't yet caught up with human capacity for evil, but her methods would be obsolete in today's investigative environment. The broader sociological impact of the case revealed uncomfortable truths about American society's relationship with race, class, and assumptions about criminality. Susan's decision to blame a fictional black perpetrator for her crimes exposed deep-seated prejudices that law enforcement and the media had unconsciously embraced. The killer's manipulation of racial stereotypes became a catalyst for difficult conversations about how bias affects criminal investigations and public perception. The psychological autopsy of Susan Smith, conducted by forensic experts, painted a portrait of a killer whose narcissistic personality disorder had been masked by her ability to manipulate social situations to her advantage. Her lifelong pattern of deception, manipulation, and self-serving behavior had culminated in the ultimate expression of her pathology, the murder of her own children when they became inconvenient to her desires. The killer's psychological profile became a textbook example of how personality disorders can escalate to homicidal behavior when combined with specific stressors. The law enforcement response to the case led to significant changes in how missing children investigations are conducted, with new emphasis on thoroughly investigating all possibilities, including parental involvement, before accepting witness accounts at face value. Susan's 9-day deception had consumed enormous resources and endangered public safety by diverting attention from legitimate threats. The killer's legacy included improved investigative protocols designed to prevent similar manipulation of law enforcement resources. The media ethics discussions sparked by the case examined how reporters and news organizations had been manipulated by Susan's performance, leading to new standards for verification of information and more skeptical approaches to emotionally compelling stories. The killer's ability to weaponize media sympathy had demonstrated the dangers of accepting dramatic narratives without independent corroboration, fundamentally changing journalistic practices in covering similar cases. Susan's life in prison has been marked by continued attempts at manipulation, including inappropriate relationships with corrections officers and efforts to profit from her notoriety through interviews and correspondence. The killer's inability to reform or demonstrate genuine remorse has validated the jury's decision to spare her life while ensuring she would never again have the opportunity to harm innocent victims. The impact on the Union community where the crimes occurred has been lasting and profound, with many residents still struggling to reconcile the horror of what happened in their midst with their memories of Susan as a seemingly normal young mother. The killer had walked among them undetected, a monster hiding behind a mask of respectability, forever changing how the community viewed the people around them. The academic study of filicide has been significantly influenced by the Susan Smith case, with researchers examining how maternal killers differ from other types of murderers and what warning signs might have been present before her crimes escalated to homicide. The killer became an unwilling subject for scientific inquiry into the darkest aspects of human behavior, her crimes contributing to understanding that might help prevent similar tragedies. The victim impact on extended family members, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and family friends who had loved Michael and Alexander, created a secondary circle of trauma that continues to reverberate decades later. The killer's actions had destroyed not just 2 young lives, but an entire network of relationships and family connections that could never be repaired. Today, as Susan Smith approaches her 3rd decade in prison, she remains a symbol of the ultimate betrayal of parental responsibility. Her crimes serve as a stark reminder that evil can inhabit the most trusted relationships, and that the capacity for horrific violence can lurk behind facades of normalcy and respectability. The killer who once commanded international sympathy now exists in well-deserved obscurity, her infamy serving as a warning about the monsters that sometimes hide in plain sight. The legacy of Michael and Alexander Smith lives on through child advocacy organizations, improved investigative techniques, and the eternal vigilance of those who remember that innocence must be protected from those who would destroy it for their own selfish purposes. Their brief lives, cut short by maternal malice, continue to serve as beacons of hope that justice can prevail even against the most calculating forms of evil. The case stands as a permanent reminder that the greatest horrors are often perpetrated not by strangers lurking in shadows, but by those we trust most completely, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who know exactly which mask to wear to hide their true nature from an unsuspecting world. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5: When Evil Hides in Plain Sight, the Toy Box Killer. In the blazing heat of truth or consequences, New Mexico, a seemingly ordinary trailer sat parked behind a modest home on Bass Road. To neighbors, it appeared unremarkable, just another piece of property in a quiet desert town where people minded their own business. But behind those aluminum walls lay a chamber of horrors so meticulously planned, so methodically constructed, that even seasoned FBI agents would struggle to comprehend the depth of depravity it contained. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a laboratory of human suffering, designed by a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of terror. David Parker Ray, a 59-year-old mechanic with the demeanor of a friendly grandfather, had created what investigators would later call the most sophisticated torture chamber in FBI history. For over 4 decades, this unassuming man had been living a double life so sinister that when the truth finally emerged, it would shake the very foundations of criminal psychology and forever change how law enforcement approaches missing persons cases. What you're about to discover is not just the story of one man's descent into evil, but a chilling reminder that monsters don't always lurk in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they live next door, wave hello at the grocery store, and help neighbors fix their cars. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy while orchestrating nightmares beyond imagination. This is the story of how a small-town mechanic became one of America's most prolific serial killers, and how a single act of courage finally brought his reign of terror to an end. David Parker Ray wasn't born a monster. He was methodically crafted into one through a childhood steeped in dysfunction, neglect, and early exposure to violence that would plant the seeds of the horror he would later unleash upon the world. Born on November 6, 1939, in Belen, New Mexico, Ray's early years were marked by abandonment and trauma that would echo through decades of unspeakable crimes. His parents, Cecil and Nettie Ray, were ill-equipped for the responsibilities of raising children. When David was just 10 years old, his mother abandoned the family, leaving him in the care of a father who was more interested in alcohol than parenting. The psychological wounds of maternal abandonment would fester and grow, transforming into a deep-seated hatred of women that would later manifest in the most horrific ways imaginable. Raised primarily by his grandfather and various relatives, Ray learned early that violence was an acceptable way to exert control. His grandfather, a man with his own disturbing tendencies, introduced young David to pornography and violent sexual content at an age when most children are learning to ride bicycles. This early sexualization, combined with the emotional neglect he experienced, began to warp his developing psyche in ways that would have devastating consequences for countless innocent women. As a teenager, Ray's disturbing fantasies began to crystallize. He would later confess to investigators that he started having detailed dreams about kidnapping and controlling women when he was just 14 years old. These weren't fleeting thoughts or typical adolescent fantasies. They were elaborate, methodical scenarios that he would spend hours planning and refining in his mind. Even then, he was laying the psychological groundwork for what would become his life's horrific work. After a brief stint in the army, Ray returned to New Mexico and settled into what appeared to be a normal life. He worked as a mechanic at New Mexico State Parks, a job that required him to be helpful, reliable, and trustworthy, qualities that would later serve as the perfect cover for his sinister activities. To his co-workers, Ray was simply Dave, a quiet, competent man who kept to himself but was always willing to lend a hand when needed. Ray married several times throughout his life, relationships that would provide crucial insight into his developing pathology. His wives would later describe a man who was obsessively controlling, sexually deviant, and psychologically manipulative. Behind closed doors, Ray was already practicing the techniques he would later perfect on his victims: isolation, intimidation, and the systematic breaking down of a person's will to resist. It was during his second marriage that Ray began to act on his fantasies in earnest. He started frequenting bars and clubs, not for socializing, but for hunting. He developed an almost supernatural ability to identify vulnerable women, those who were isolated, struggling with addiction, or living on society's margins. These were women who, if they disappeared, might not be immediately missed or actively searched for by law enforcement. Ray's selection process was methodical and calculating. He would spend weeks, sometimes months, studying potential victims, learning their routines, their weaknesses, their support systems, or lack thereof. He understood that successful predation required patience, planning, and the ability to exploit human psychology. He wasn't an impulsive killer driven by rage or passion. He was a cold, calculating predator who treated his crimes like a carefully planned business operation. The construction of what would become known as the toy box began in the late 1970s. Ray purchased a white cargo trailer and began its horrific transformation with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else in his double life. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision or a crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of decades of fantasy, planning, and preparation. Working primarily at night and in complete secrecy, Ray spent years converting the trailer into what investigators would later describe as a medieval torture chamber updated with modern technology. Every detail was carefully planned, from the soundproofing that would muffle screams to the elaborate system of restraints that would render escape impossible. The trailer was equipped with a gynecological examination table, mirrors positioned to create psychological torture, and an array of implements designed to inflict maximum suffering while keeping victims alive and conscious. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ray's preparation was his creation of detailed audio recordings that would be played to victims upon their arrival. These recordings, which investigators would later discover, were masterpieces of psychological warfare, carefully scripted monologues designed to break down a victim's hope, resistance, and sense of reality. Ray had studied enough psychology to understand that physical torture was only part of the equation. True control required the complete destruction of a person's mental defenses. The audio tapes revealed the depth of Ray's planning and the calculated nature of his crimes. He had anticipated every possible scenario, every form of resistance, every psychological defense mechanism his victims might employ. The recordings were updated and refined over the years, incorporating lessons learned from previous victims and new techniques designed to maximize psychological trauma. As the 1980s progressed, Ray's confidence grew. He had perfected his hunting techniques, refined his methods of abduction, and created what he believed to be the perfect crime scene. The isolated location of his property, combined with his reputation as a helpful, law-abiding citizen, provided the perfect cover for his activities. Neighbors occasionally heard sounds from the direction of his trailer, but Ray had prepared explanations. He was working on mechanical projects, testing equipment, or hosting private parties. Ray also began to recruit accomplices, understanding that his expanding operation would require assistance. He was particularly skilled at identifying individuals who were vulnerable to manipulation, people with their own psychological issues, financial problems, or legal troubles that made them dependent on his protection and support. These accomplices would later prove crucial to both the scope of his crimes and, ultimately, to his downfall. The psychology of David Parker Ray presents a fascinating and terrifying case study in the development of a serial killer. Unlike many criminals who act impulsively or are driven by uncontrollable urges, Ray represented a new breed of predator, one who approached his crimes with the systematic methodology of a scientist conducting experiments. He kept detailed records, analyzed the effectiveness of different techniques, and constantly refined his methods based on results. What made Ray particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his life so completely. During the day, he was a model employee and seemingly normal community member. He participated in local activities, maintained friendly relationships with neighbors, and even helped with community projects. This ability to maintain a completely normal facade while harboring such dark impulses is what allowed him to operate undetected for so many years. By the late 1980s, Ray had essentially created his own private kingdom of terror. The trailer, which he had nicknamed his toy box, was fully operational and had already claimed an unknown number of victims. Ray had become so confident in his methods and so assured of his invincibility that he began to take greater risks, holding victims for longer periods and expanding the scope of his activities. The stage was set for what would become one of the most horrific crime sprees in American history. Ray had spent decades preparing, planning, and perfecting his techniques. He had created the perfect crime scene, developed foolproof methods of victim selection and abduction, and surrounded himself with accomplices who were too compromised or too afraid to betray him. What Ray couldn't have anticipated was that his very success would eventually lead to his downfall. The more confident he became, the more risks he took. The longer he operated, the more evidence he accumulated. And the more victims he claimed, the greater the chances became that one would eventually escape to tell their story. The quiet desert town of Truth or Consequences was about to discover that one of their most trusted citizens was, in fact, one of the most dangerous predators in American criminal history. The mask of normalcy that Ray had worn so expertly for so many years was about to slip, revealing the monster that had been hiding underneath all along. Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, seemed like an unlikely hunting ground for a serial killer. Named after a popular radio show in 1950, the small town of fewer than 8,000 residents sat nestled along the Rio Grande, known primarily for its hot springs and as a retirement destination for those seeking a quiet desert lifestyle. The landscape was stark and beautiful, with endless stretches of high desert punctuated by dramatic mesas and the life-giving ribbon of the river. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear from their old lives, to start fresh, or simply to fade quietly into anonymity. For David Parker Ray, these characteristics made Truth or Consequences the perfect stalking ground. The transient population meant that people came and went regularly without raising suspicion. The isolated geography provided countless locations where evidence could be disposed of and where screams would never be heard. Most importantly, the town attracted exactly the type of vulnerable individuals Ray preferred to target. Women who were running from troubled pasts, struggling with addiction, or simply trying to rebuild their lives far from the watchful eyes of family and former communities. Ray's hunting methodology was a masterclass in predatory behavior, refined over decades of practice. He understood that successful serial killing required more than just opportunity and means. It required a deep understanding of human psychology, social dynamics, and law enforcement limitations. Ray had studied these elements as methodically as a military strategist planning a campaign. His primary hunting grounds were the bars and clubs scattered throughout southern New Mexico. Ray would spend entire evenings in these establishments, not drinking heavily or drawing attention to himself, but quietly observing and cataloging potential victims. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to identify women who fit his preferred victim profile. Those who appeared to be alone, struggling financially, dealing with substance abuse issues, or lacking strong social connections that would trigger immediate searches if they disappeared. Ray's approach was patience incarnate. He would often observe potential victims for weeks or months before making his move, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He would strike up casual conversations, present himself as a friendly, helpful local, and gradually work his way into their lives. His reputation as a reliable mechanic often provided the perfect entry point. He would offer to fix a woman's car problems, provide rides when transportation was needed, or simply be a sympathetic ear during difficult times. The psychology behind Ray's victim selection revealed a predator who understood human nature with chilling clarity. He specifically targeted women who were likely to be dismissed or overlooked by law enforcement sex workers, drug users, drifters, and those with criminal histories. Ray knew that these women, if they disappeared, would often be written off as having simply moved on to another town or having fallen victim to the dangerous lifestyle choices that society already judged them for making. One of Ray's most effective tactics was his use of seemingly legitimate offers of help. He would identify women who were struggling with car troubles, housing issues, or employment problems, and position himself as a solution to their immediate needs. His mechanical skills were genuine, his property offered what appeared to be safe temporary housing, and his connections in the community could potentially lead to job opportunities. To desperate women in difficult circumstances, Ray appeared to be a godsend rather than the monster he truly was. Ray also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of timing and opportunity. He would often approach women during periods of particular vulnerability, after they had been drinking, during moments of personal crisis, or when they were geographically isolated from their support systems. He understood that desperation and intoxication could cloud judgment and make individuals more susceptible to manipulation. The abduction methods Ray employed were as varied as they were effective. Sometimes he would simply offer rides to women who were walking alone at night, using his reputation as a helpful community member to overcome natural caution. Other times, he would lure victims to his property under false pretenses, offering employment opportunities, claiming to have information about missing friends, or suggesting his trailer contained items the women might want to purchase. Ray's property on Bass Road was perfectly situated for his purposes. Located on the outskirts of town, the 5-acre lot provided complete privacy for his activities. The property was surrounded by high desert terrain that offered natural sound barriers and unlimited space for evidence disposal. Neighbors were far enough away that unusual sounds or activities were unlikely to be noticed, and the isolated location meant that victims' screams would never be heard by potential rescuers. The toy box itself was a marvel of meticulous planning and construction. Ray had spent years and thousands of dollars creating what investigators would later describe as the most sophisticated torture chamber in FBI history. The white cargo trailer, measuring approximately 25 feet in length, had been completely stripped and rebuilt according to Ray's horrific specifications. Every aspect of the trailer's design served a specific purpose in Ray's methodology. The exterior was deliberately unremarkable, designed to blend in with the other equipment and vehicles scattered around his property. The windows were covered and reinforced to prevent escape attempts, while specialized ventilation systems ensured that victims would remain conscious and aware throughout their ordeals. The interior of the trailer revealed the true depth of Ray's depravity and planning. The space had been divided into specific areas, each designed for different aspects of his crimes. The main area contained a gynecological examination table that had been modified with an elaborate system of restraints, making escape impossible once a victim was secured. Mirrors were strategically positioned to amplify psychological torture, forcing victims to witness their own suffering from multiple angles. Ray had also installed a sophisticated audio system throughout the trailer, wired to play the psychological warfare recordings he had created specifically for new victims. These recordings, which would later prove crucial to the prosecution's case, revealed a predator who had studied the psychological aspects of torture with the dedication of a graduate student. The tapes were carefully scripted to break down victims' hope, resistance, and sense of reality within the first few hours of captivity. The level of detail in Ray's preparations extended to every aspect of the victim experience. He had researched and acquired an extensive collection of implements specifically chosen for their ability to inflict suffering while keeping victims alive and conscious. The trailer contained medical supplies to treat injuries and prevent infections, demonstrating Ray's intention to keep victims alive for extended periods. Perhaps most chillingly, Ray had created detailed written procedures for every aspect of his crimes. Investigators would later discover notebooks containing step-by-step instructions for victim abduction, initial processing, ongoing torture protocols, and eventual disposal methods. These documents revealed a predator who had industrialized his crimes, creating systematic processes designed for maximum efficiency and minimum risk of detection. Ray's methodology also included sophisticated evidence destruction protocols. He had studied law enforcement investigation techniques and had developed methods to minimize physical evidence that could link him to his crimes. The remote location of his property provided access to abandoned mine shafts and deep desert areas where evidence could be disposed of permanently. The recruitment and management of accomplices represented another aspect of Ray's sophisticated criminal operation. He had identified and cultivated relationships with individuals who could assist with various aspects of his crimes, from initial victim identification and abduction to ongoing captivity management and evidence disposal. These accomplices were carefully chosen for their vulnerabilities, their own criminal inclinations, and their dependence on Ray's protection and support. Ray's understanding of law enforcement limitations was particularly sophisticated. He had studied missing persons investigation procedures and understood that certain types of disappearances were less likely to trigger intensive investigations. His careful victim selection and the isolated location of his crimes meant that even if suspicions were raised, physical evidence would be extremely difficult to locate and develop. The scope of Ray's operation gradually expanded throughout the 1980s and 1990s. What had begun as the fulfillment of personal fantasies had evolved into what investigators would later describe as an industrial-scale torture and murder operation. Ray had become so confident in his methods and so assured of his invincibility that he began documenting his crimes in detail, keeping souvenirs, and even creating instructional materials for potential future accomplices. By the late 1990s, Ray had been operating his torture chamber for over 2 decades. Estimates of his victim count would vary wildly, with some investigators suggesting the number could be as high as 60 or more women. The true count may never be known, as Ray had perfected methods of evidence disposal that made victim identification extremely difficult. The very success of Ray's operation, however, contained the seeds of his eventual downfall. The longer he operated, the more evidence accumulated. The more confident he became, the greater risks he took. The more accomplices he recruited, the more people who knew his secrets. And the more victims he claimed, the greater the mathematical probability that one would eventually escape to tell their story. Unknown to Ray, the perfect predatory operation he had spent decades constructing was about to unravel in the most dramatic way possible. A single act of courage by one intended victim would soon expose the full horror of what had been happening in the quiet desert town of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. March 22, 1999, dawned like any other day in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. The desert sun cast long shadows across the sparse landscape, and David Parker Ray began what he assumed would be another routine day in his carefully orchestrated double life. For over 2 decades, Ray had maintained perfect operational security, leaving no survivors and no witnesses to his horrific crimes. His methodical approach to victim selection, abduction, and disposal had created what he believed to be an impenetrable wall of silence around his activities. But on this particular day, Ray's overconfidence would lead to a critical error in judgment, one that would ultimately bring his entire operation crashing down and expose the full horror of what had been happening behind the walls of his innocuous-looking trailer. The unraveling began with Cynthia Vigil, a 22-year-old woman whose life had been marked by the same vulnerabilities that Ray typically exploited in his victim selection process. Struggling with drug addiction and working as a prostitute to survive, Vigil represented exactly the type of victim Ray had successfully targeted for years, someone whose disappearance might be attributed to the dangerous lifestyle choices society already judged her for making. Ray's initial contact with Vigil followed his established pattern. He approached her while she was working the streets of Albuquerque, presenting himself as a potential client, but gradually transitioning into the role of helpful benefactor. Using techniques he had perfected over decades, Ray gained Vigil's trust by offering assistance with her immediate needs and presenting himself as someone who could provide safety and stability in her chaotic life. The abduction itself was executed with Ray's typical methodical precision. Rather than using force or obvious coercion, Ray manipulated Vigil into voluntarily accompanying him to his property under false pretenses. By the time she realized the true nature of her situation, she was already secured within the soundproof walls of the toy box, beginning what Ray intended to be another successful long-term captivity. For 3 agonizing days, Vigil endured the full horror of Ray's systematic torture protocols. She was subjected to the psychological warfare of his recorded introductions, the physical torment of his elaborate restraint systems, and the methodical brutality that Ray had refined through years of practice on previous victims. Like so many women before her, Vigil found herself trapped in a nightmare scenario that challenged the very limits of human endurance and psychological survival. But Cynthia Vigil possessed something that would prove to be Ray's undoing: an unbreakable will to survive and an absolute refusal to accept the fate Ray had planned for her. Despite the overwhelming horror of her situation, despite the carefully crafted psychological pressure designed to break her spirit, Vigil maintained her determination to escape and expose the monster who had captured her. Ray's first critical error came on the 3rd day of Vigil's captivity. Overconfident in his security measures and convinced of his victim's complete helplessness, Ray became careless about maintaining constant surveillance. When he and his accomplice Cindy Hendy temporarily left the trailer, they made the fatal mistake of leaving Vigil partially unsecured, a deviation from Ray's normally rigid security protocols. What happened next would later be described by investigators as one of the most courageous acts in the history of criminal justice. Despite being weakened by days of torture and psychological abuse, Vigil managed to partially free herself from her restraints. Using an ice pick that had been carelessly left within her reach, she began the painstaking process of picking the locks that secured her to the examination table. The escape itself required not just physical strength and dexterity, but incredible mental fortitude. Vigil had to work in complete silence, knowing that discovery would likely result in even more severe torture or immediate death. She had to overcome the psychological programming that Ray's recordings and abuse had been designed to instill, fighting against the learned helplessness that had claimed so many previous victims. When Vigil finally freed herself from the restraints, she found herself faced with another seemingly impossible challenge: escaping from the soundproof, reinforced trailer while potentially armed captors could return at any moment. But her determination to survive overcame even these obstacles. She managed to break through a window and flee into the desert, despite being naked and still bearing the physical evidence of her prolonged torture. Vigil's appearance on the streets of Truth or Consequences, running naked and screaming for help while wearing only a metal collar and chain, created an immediate sensation that Ray could not control or suppress. Unlike the carefully planned disappearances of his previous victims, Vigil's dramatic escape occurred in broad daylight in full view of multiple witnesses who immediately contacted law enforcement. The initial police response revealed how effectively Ray had managed to maintain his cover within the community. When officers first encountered Vigil's incredible story of imprisonment and torture, some were initially skeptical. Ray's reputation as a helpful, law-abiding citizen was so well established that the idea of him as a serial killer seemed almost impossible to believe. But the physical evidence of Vigil's ordeal was undeniable. The metal restraints still attached to her body, the obvious signs of prolonged torture and abuse, and her detailed knowledge of Ray's property and methods quickly convinced investigators that they were dealing with a crime of extraordinary scope and depravity. The execution of search warrants on Ray's property would reveal the full horror of what investigators would later describe as the most sophisticated torture chamber in FBI history. The discovery of the toy box, with its elaborate restraint systems, torture implements, and psychological warfare equipment, provided overwhelming physical evidence of crimes that defied comprehension. But perhaps even more damning were the audio recordings that Ray had created for new victims. These tapes, which Vigil identified as having been played during her captivity, provided a chilling window into Ray's methodology and psychology. The recordings were so detailed and specific that they served as virtual confessions to decades of crimes, describing torture techniques and victim disposal methods with scientific precision. As investigators processed the evidence from Ray's property, the true scope of his operation began to emerge. The discovery of personal items belonging to numerous women, detailed victim logs, and photographs documenting his crimes revealed a predator who had been operating on an industrial scale for over 2 decades. The investigation also uncovered Ray's network of accomplices, individuals who had assisted with various aspects of his crimes over the years. These accomplices, when confronted with the overwhelming evidence against Ray and facing potential conspiracy charges themselves, began to cooperate with investigators, providing crucial testimony about the scope and methods of Ray's operation. One of the most significant accomplices was Cindy Hendy, Ray's girlfriend and primary assistant in his crimes. Hendy had been present during many of the torture sessions and had assisted with victim abduction and captivity management. Her detailed knowledge of Ray's methods and her willingness to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence provided prosecutors with an insider's view of the operation's scope and methodology. The testimony of accomplices also helped investigators understand how Ray had managed to operate undetected for so long. His careful victim selection, sophisticated evidence disposal methods, and ability to maintain a completely normal public facade had created what appeared to be the perfect crime operation. It was only through the combination of Vigil's extraordinary courage and the cooperation of accomplices seeking leniency that the full truth finally emerged. As word of Ray's arrest and the discovery of his torture chamber spread throughout Truth or Consequences, the community struggled to comprehend how such horror could have existed undetected in their midst. Neighbors who had known Ray for years found it almost impossible to reconcile the helpful mechanic they knew with the monster revealed by the investigation. The case also triggered a massive review of missing persons cases throughout the southwestern United States. Investigators began working with law enforcement agencies across multiple states to identify potential victims and establish connections between Ray's operation and unsolved disappearances dating back decades. The psychological impact on the community was profound and lasting. Trust or consequences residents found themselves questioning their ability to recognize danger, wondering how many other seemingly normal community members might be harboring similar secrets. The case shattered the small-town assumption that something like this could never happen here. For law enforcement, Ray's case represented both a triumphant resolution and a sobering reminder of the limitations of traditional investigative methods. The fact that Ray had operated undetected for so long, despite claiming numerous victims, highlighted the challenges inherent in investigating crimes against society's most vulnerable members. The arrest of David Parker Ray marked the beginning of what would become one of the most complex and challenging prosecutions in New Mexico legal history. The evidence was overwhelming but also deeply disturbing, requiring investigators, attorneys, and eventually jurors to confront the darkest aspects of human behavior while seeking justice for victims who might never be fully identified or recovered. Cynthia Vigil's courage in escaping from Ray's torture chamber and her willingness to testify against her captor had not only saved her own life, but had also ensured that one of America's most prolific serial killers would finally face justice for his crimes. The web of secrecy and terror that Ray had woven around his operation was finally unraveling, exposing the full horror of what had been happening in the New Mexico desert for over 2 decades. The prosecution of David Parker Ray would prove to be one of the most complex and challenging cases in New Mexico legal history. The sheer scope of his crimes, the disturbing nature of the evidence, and the psychological impact on everyone involved created unprecedented challenges for the judicial system. District Attorney Ron Lopez and his team found themselves confronting not just a serial killer, but a criminal operation so methodical and extensive that it challenged traditional approaches to prosecution and justice. The evidence collected from Ray's property was both overwhelming and deeply traumatic to process. The toy box itself served as a 3-dimensional crime scene that documented decades of torture and murder with horrific clarity. Every surface, every implement, every modification Ray had made to the trailer told part of the story of his victim's suffering. For investigators and attorneys who had to catalog and analyze this evidence, the psychological toll was immense. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of building a case against Ray was the absence of bodies. Despite overwhelming evidence of his crimes, Ray's sophisticated disposal methods meant that investigators were unable to locate and identify most of his victims. This created a unique prosecutorial challenge. How do you prove murder without bodies? And how do you achieve justice for victims whose very existence could not be definitively established? The audio recordings Ray had created for his victims became central to the prosecution's strategy. These tapes, which detailed his torture methods and disposal techniques with clinical precision, served as virtual confessions to his crimes. The recordings were so specific and detailed that they provided investigators with a roadmap of Ray's methodology, even in the absence of physical evidence from individual victims. Ray's psychological profile, as it emerged during the investigation, revealed a predator of extraordinary sophistication and planning. Unlike many serial killers who act impulsively or are driven by uncontrollable urges, Ray had approached his crimes with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting research. He had studied psychology, law enforcement techniques, and even medical procedures to optimize his methods and minimize his chances of detection. The recruitment and testimony of accomplices proved crucial to establishing the full scope of Ray's operation. Cindy Hendy, his primary accomplice, provided detailed testimony about the inner workings of the torture chamber and Ray's methods. Her cooperation was essential to the prosecution's case, but it also highlighted the complex moral and legal questions surrounding accomplice testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Other accomplices, including Ray's daughter Glenda Jean Jessie Ray, provided additional pieces of the puzzle. Jessie Ray had assisted with victim recruitment and abduction, using her appearance as a normal young woman to gain victims' trust before delivering them to her father. Her involvement in the crimes added another layer of horror to an already incomprehensible case. The trial itself presented unique challenges for all involved. The evidence was so disturbing that special protocols had to be established to protect jurors, court personnel, and spectators from psychological trauma. The graphic nature of Ray's recordings and the detailed testimony about torture methods required careful handling to ensure that justice could be served without causing unnecessary suffering to those involved in the legal process. Cynthia Vigil's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Her courage in facing her tormentor in court and providing detailed testimony about her ordeal demonstrated a strength of character that inspired everyone involved in the case. Vigil's willingness to relive her trauma in service of justice ensured that Ray would face consequences for his crimes and potentially prevented him from claiming additional victims. The defense strategy was severely limited by the overwhelming evidence against Ray. His attorneys were faced with the impossible task of defending a client whose own recordings provided detailed confessions to his crimes. The physical evidence from his property, the testimony of accomplices, and the survivor testimony from Vigil created a prosecutorial case that was virtually airtight. Ray himself remained largely unrepentant throughout the legal proceedings. His demeanor in court was consistent with the calculating, emotionless persona revealed by his crimes. He showed no remorse for his victims and appeared to view the legal proceedings as an inconvenience rather than the reckoning for decades of torture and murder. The sentencing phase of Ray's case reflected the challenge of delivering appropriate justice for crimes of such scope and depravity. While prosecutors sought the death penalty, New Mexico's complex capital punishment laws and the specific circumstances of Ray's case ultimately resulted in a sentence of 224 years in prison, effectively ensuring that he would never again be free to harm another victim. The impact of Ray's case extended far beyond the courtroom. Law enforcement agencies throughout the Southwest began reviewing decades of missing persons cases, looking for potential connections to Ray's operation. The case highlighted significant gaps in how society protects its most vulnerable members and how law enforcement investigates disappearances of individuals living on society's margins. The psychological impact on the truth or consequences community was profound and lasting. Residents struggled to comprehend how such horror could have existed undetected in their midst for so long. The case shattered assumptions about safety and forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions about how well they really knew their neighbors. For victim advocacy groups, Ray's case became a powerful example of why society must do more to protect vulnerable women and take seriously the disappearances of individuals involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, or living transient lifestyles. The case highlighted how Ray had specifically targeted women whose disappearances were likely to be dismissed or inadequately investigated by law enforcement. The investigation also revealed troubling questions about how many other predators might be operating undetected by specifically targeting society's most vulnerable members. Ray's success in avoiding detection for decades suggested that traditional law enforcement methods might be inadequate for identifying and stopping predators who carefully select victims unlikely to be missed or thoroughly investigated. Medical and psychological experts who studied Ray's case contributed to a growing understanding of serial killer psychology and methodology. Ray's systematic approach to his crimes, his detailed record-keeping, and his ability to maintain a normal facade while committing horrific acts provided valuable insights into the minds of sophisticated predators. The technological aspects of Ray's operation also attracted attention from law enforcement agencies seeking to understand how criminals might use technology and careful planning to evade detection. His soundproof torture chamber, elaborate restraint systems, and sophisticated evidence disposal methods demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication that required new investigative approaches. Ray's death in prison on May 28, 2002, just 2 years after his sentencing, brought a form of closure to the case but also left many questions unanswered. His death meant that investigators would never have the opportunity to learn the full scope of his crimes or the fate of his many victims. The true number of women who suffered and died in his torture chamber will likely never be known. The legacy of David Parker Ray's crimes continues to influence law enforcement training, victim advocacy efforts, and community awareness programs. His case serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear most normal, who integrate seamlessly into their communities, and who target society's most vulnerable members. For Cynthia Vigil, whose courage in escaping and testifying helped bring Ray to justice, the case represents both personal triumph and ongoing struggle. Her survival and bravery not only saved her own life but likely prevented Ray from claiming additional victims. Her testimony ensured that one of America's most prolific serial killers faced justice for his crimes. The Toy Box Killer case stands as one of the most horrific examples of human evil in American criminal history. But it also demonstrates the power of human courage, the importance of taking seriously crimes against vulnerable populations, and the need for constant vigilance against those who would exploit society's most defenseless members. The desert around truth or consequences still holds its secrets. Somewhere in those endless stretches of sand and stone lie the remains of women whose names we may never know, whose families still wonder what happened to them, whose stories deserve to be remembered even if their bodies are never recovered. Their memory serves as both a tribute to lives cut short and a reminder that justice, while sometimes delayed, must never be denied. David Parker Ray's reign of terror is over, but the lessons learned from his crimes continue to resonate throughout the law enforcement community and society as a whole. In confronting the darkest aspects of human nature, we strengthen our resolve to protect the innocent and ensure that such horrors can never again hide in plain sight in our communities. The story of the Toy Box Killer serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the courage of survivors like Cynthia Vigil, in the dedication of investigators who refused to give up, and in the determination of prosecutors who sought justice despite overwhelming challenges, we find hope that good can ultimately triumph over evil, even in the darkest corners of the human experience. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.